before the Great Pyramid, before the Sphinx, before the Valley of the Kings and the golden mask of Tutankhamun and everything that the modern world associates with ancient Egypt, there was a moment, a single moment in which everything changed, a moment in which a civilization that had been building in mud brick for centuries looked at a block of stone and saw, for the first time, something that mud brick could never be, something permanent, something that would not dissolve in the rain, would not crumble in the wind, would not return to the earth from which it was made within a few generations, something that would last. That moment happened at Saqqara, the ancient necropolis on the desert plateau above Memphis, the capital of the Old Kingdom Egyptian state. It happened during the reign of a pharaoh named Djoser, also known as Netjereket, a king of the 3rd dynasty who ruled Egypt approximately 4,700 years ago. And it happened because of a man, a single, extraordinary, historically unprecedented man, whose name was Imhotep, the vizier, the architect, the physician, the priestess, the man who looked at the desert plateau of Saqqara and imagined something that no human being had ever imagined before, a building made entirely of cut stone, rising from the desert floor in a series of steps that climbed toward the sky, like a staircase built for a god. The Step Pyramid of Giza is not the largest pyramid in Egypt. It is not the tallest. It is not the most precisely constructed. It is not the most famous. But it is the most important, because it was the first monumental stone structure in human history, the first building in which an architect took the material of the earth itself, the limestone bedrock of the Saqqara plateau, and transformed it into a structure that was designed to endure forever. Every stone building that has been built in the 4,700 years since the Step Pyramid, every cathedral, every castle, every palace, every skyscraper with a stone facade, is a descendant of the structure that Imhotep built on the desert plateau above Memphis. The Step Pyramid is the ancestor of them all. The numbers are striking. The pyramid rises to a height of roughly 62 meters, not as tall as the Great Pyramid of Giza, which would be built a century later, but taller than any structure that existed anywhere in the world at the time of its construction. Its base measures roughly 125 meters by 109 meters, a rectangular footprint rather than the square footprint of later pyramids, a reminder that the design was experimental and that the conventions of pyramid construction had not yet been established. The pyramid contains approximately 330,000 cubic meters of stone and clay, stone that was quarried, shaped, transported, and placed by a workforce whose size is unknown but whose achievement is beyond dispute. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand the story of the building that changed everything, the structure that marked the boundary between the world of mud brick and the world of stone, between the architecture of the temporary and the architecture of the eternal, between the civilization that built for a generation and the civilization that built for forever. The story of Imhotep, the story of Djoser, the story of the Step Pyramid of Saqqara. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it genuinely helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. The Step Pyramid is a building that looks backward and forward simultaneously, backward to the mud brick tradition from which it emerged, forward to the stone tradition that it created. Its form, the stepped profile, the rectangular base, the relatively small block size, betrays its origins in the world of mud brick mastabas. Its material, cut limestone, quarried from the bedrock of the Saqqara plateau, shaped by copper tools and human hands, announces its entry into a new world, the world of permanent architecture, the world in which buildings are designed not for a generation but for eternity. The tension between the old form and the new material is the creative tension at the heart of the Step Pyramid's story, the tension that makes it both a culmination and a beginning, both the last great expression of the mud brick tradition and the first great expression of the stone tradition that would replace it. The structure that Imhotep built at Saqqara was not merely the first pyramid. It was the first stone building of any kind that was designed and executed at monumental scale, a distinction that makes it arguably the single most important building in the history of human architecture. Every stone cathedral in Europe, every stone temple in Asia, every stone monument on every continent traces its lineage, however indirectly, to the conceptual breakthrough that occurred at Saqqara, when Imhotep demonstrated that stone could be used not merely for small architectural elements, but for entire monumental structures. The breakthrough was not incremental, it was categorical. It created a new possibility that had not existed before, a possibility that would transform the built environment of the human world for the next 5 millennia. Now, let's begin. To understand the step pyramid, you must first understand what came before it. The world of mud brick architecture that the step pyramid replaced, and the building tradition from which it emerged. For centuries before the step pyramid was built, the Egyptians had been constructing tombs for their rulers and their elite. Tombs that were, by the standards of the ancient world, impressive in their scale and their elaboration. These tombs were called mastabas, flat-topped, rectangular structures made of mud brick that were built over underground burial chambers. The word mastaba comes from the Arabic for bench, a description that captures the shape of these structures as they appear from the outside. Low, flat-topped rectangles that rise from the desert surface like enormous platforms. The mastabas of the early dynastic period, the first and second dynasties, were substantial structures, some of them measuring tens of meters in length and standing several meters high. They were built of mud brick, sun-dried bricks made from Nile mud mixed with straw, a building material that was abundant, inexpensive, and easy to work, but that had a fundamental limitation. It was not permanent. Mud brick dissolves in water, it crumbles in wind, it erodes over time. A mud brick structure, however well built, will eventually return to the earth from which it was made, a process that can take centuries, but that is, ultimately, inevitable. The impermanence of mud brick was a problem for a civilization that was obsessed with eternity. The Egyptians believed that the survival of the deceased in the afterlife depended on the survival of the tomb, the structure that housed the body, the offerings, and the funerary equipment that sustained the soul in the eternal realm. A tomb that collapsed, that eroded, that dissolved in the rain, was a tomb that fulfilled in its fundamental purpose. The purpose of providing a permanent home for the dead. The search for permanence, for a building material and a building method that could create structures that would endure for eternity, was therefore not merely an aesthetic or an engineering pursuit. It was a religious imperative, a response to the deepest spiritual needs of a civilization that measured the value of its architecture by its capacity to resist the destructive forces of time. The transition from mud brick to stone did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process, a series of experiments and innovations that extended over the early dynastic period and that culminated, during the reign of Djoser, in the revolutionary decision to build an entire monumental complex in cut stone. The earliest experiments with stone in Egyptian architecture involved the use of stone elements within mud brick structures, stone door frames, stone lintels, stone flooring in important rooms, stone linings for burial chambers. These early uses of stone were limited in scale and in ambition. They supplemented mud brick rather than replacing it, and they did not challenge the fundamental assumption that monumental architecture was built of mud brick with stone used only for specific, functional or decorative purposes. The genius of Imhotep was to see beyond these limited applications, to recognize that stone could be used not merely as a supplement to mud brick, but as a replacement for it, not merely for individual elements, but for entire structures, not merely for small-scale construction, but for monumental architecture on a scale that had never been attempted before. The recognition was not merely technical. It was not simply a matter of figuring out how to cut and place stone blocks. It was conceptual, a fundamental shift in the way that architecture was imagined, a realization that the permanence that the Egyptian religious system demanded could only be achieved by abandoning the traditional building material entirely and embracing a new material that was, in every respect, more difficult to work with, but that offered the one quality that mud brick could never provide: the capacity to endure. Imhotep is one of the most remarkable figures in ancient history, and one of the most underappreciated by the modern world, which tends to focus on the pharaohs and the monuments, rather than on the architects and the engineers who made the monuments possible. He served as the vizier of Djoser, the chief administrator of the Egyptian state, the highest-ranking official below the pharaoh himself. He was also a priest of the sun god Re at the temple of Heliopolis, a role that gave him access to the astronomical and mathematical knowledge that the Egyptian priesthood had accumulated over centuries. He was a physician. Later generations would worship him as the god of medicine, and the Greeks would identify him with their own god of healing, Asclepius. And he was an architect, the designer of the Step Pyramid complex, the creator of the first monumental stone building in human history, the man whose name would be remembered for millennia as the inventor of stone architecture. The inscription that identifies Imhotep as the architect of the Step Pyramid complex was found on a statue base at Saqqara, a fragment of stone that bears the names and titles of both Djoser and Imhotep, listing Imhotep's many roles and responsibilities in the service of the king. The inscription is significant because it is one of the earliest surviving references to a named architect in human history, a document that connects a specific individual to a specific building and that allows us to attribute the design of the Step Pyramid to a known person rather than to the anonymous collective effort that characterizes most ancient construction. Imhotep was not anonymous. He was celebrated, honored by his king, remembered by subsequent generations, and eventually elevated to the status of a god. The elevation was unprecedented. Imhotep was one of only a handful of non-royal individuals in Egyptian history to be deified, and his deification reflects the extraordinary esteem in which subsequent generations held the man who had invented stone architecture. The Third Dynasty, the dynasty in which Djoser reigned and in which the Step Pyramid was built, was a period of transition and consolidation in Egyptian history. The early dynastic period, the First and Second Dynasties, had been a time of political unification and state formation, a period in which the basic institutions of the pharaonic state were established, and the basic patterns of Egyptian culture were defined. The Third Dynasty built on these foundations, consolidating the gains of the earlier period, strengthening the institutions of the state, expanding the economic base of the kingdom, and creating the conditions that would support the extraordinary burst of monumental construction that characterized the Old Kingdom. The economic foundations of the Third Dynasty were agricultural, based on the annual flooding of the Nile, which deposited a layer of rich silt on the floodplain and created the conditions for the intensive farming that sustained the Egyptian population and generated the surplus wealth that funded state's activities. The agricultural surplus was enormous by the standards of the ancient world. Egypt was one of the most productive farming regions in the Near East, capable of feeding a large population and supporting a substantial class of non-agricultural workers who were available for state projects. The surplus was controlled by the state through a system of taxation, redistribution, and labor conscription that gave the pharaoh and his administrators access to the wealth and the labor of the entire country. The administrative apparatus that managed the state's resources was centered on the office of the vizier, the position that Imhotep held. The vizier was the pharaoh's chief executive, the official who managed the day-to-day operations of the state, supervised the provincial governors, adjudicated legal disputes, and oversaw the execution of royal commands. The vizier controlled the state granaries, the state workshops, the state labor force, and the state construction program. The position gave Imhotep the administrative authority and the access to resources that were necessary to conceive and execute a project of the Step Pyramid scale. A project that required the mobilization of quarrymen, masons, laborers, scribes, administrators, and supply workers in numbers that had never been assembled for a construction project before. The religious context of the Third Dynasty was dominated by the solar theology that was centered on the temple of Heliopolis, the temple where Imhotep served as a priest. The solar theology was one of the oldest and most influential strands of Egyptian religious thought, a theological tradition that associated the pharaoh with the sun god Re and that interpreted the Pharaoh's death and rebirth as a cosmic event analogous to the daily setting and rising of the sun. The pyramid, the structure that Imhotep would eventually create, was itself a solar symbol, its form evoking the rays of the sun descending to earth, and its orientation aligned to the cardinal points that were defined by the sun's daily journey across the sky. The religious context was not incidental to the architectural innovation. It was the driving force, the spiritual imperative that demanded permanent structures for the pharaoh's tomb, and that provided the motivation for the extraordinary effort required to build in stone. The quarries at Saqqara, the sources of the limestone that constituted the bulk of the step pyramid's mass, were located on the plateau itself, close to the construction site. The proximity of the quarries to the construction site was a significant advantage. It meant that the blocks did not need to be transported long distances, reducing the labour and the time required for the construction. The quarrying was done in open pits. The builders cut channels into the bedrock to define the size and shape of each block, then used copper chisels, wooden wedges, and stone hammers to separate the blocks from the surrounding rock. The quarrying process was labour-intensive but straightforward. The techniques were essentially the same techniques that would be refined and scaled up for the construction of the later pyramids at Giza. The transportation of blocks from the quarry to the construction site was accomplished using sledges and rollers, wooden platforms on which the blocks were placed and dragged across the desert, surfaced by teams of workers pulling on ropes. The distances were short, a few hundred meters at most, but the volume of material was enormous, requiring a constant flow of blocks from the quarry to the pyramid site throughout the construction period. The logistics of the transport operation required careful coordination, ensuring that the supply of blocks matched the pace of construction, that the quarrying teams and the transport teams were working in synchronized rhythm, and that the construction teams had a steady supply of material to work with at all times. The Saqqara Plateau, the site that Imhotep chose for the step pyramid, was already an established cemetery by the time of Djoser's reign. The plateau had been used for burials since the earliest period of Egyptian history. The tombs of the first and second dynasty rulers and officials were scattered across its surface, their mud brick superstructures rising from the desert floor in a landscape of the dead that stretched for kilometers along the western edge of the Nile Valley. The choice of Saqqara was therefore not arbitrary. It was a continuation of an existing tradition, a decision to build the pharaoh's tomb in a location that was already sacred and that was associated in the Egyptian religious imagination with the transition from the world of the living to the world of the dead. But the building that Imhotep would construct at Saqqara was unlike anything the plateau had ever seen. The mastabas of the earlier rulers were impressive by the standards of their time, but they were structures of mud brick, structures that blended into the desert landscape, and that would, over the centuries, erode and collapse and return to the earth. Imhotep's building would be different. It would be made of stone. It would rise above the desert floor to a height that no structure had ever reached. It would be visible for kilometers in every direction, a landmark that would dominate the landscape and that would proclaim, to every person who saw it, the power and the permanence of the king for whom it was built. The construction of the step pyramid complex was not a single unified project executed according to a fixed plan. It was an evolving design, a project that changed and grew as the construction progressed, as Imhotep's ambition expanded, and as the builders' confidence in their ability to work with stone increased. The archaeological evidence, carefully analysed by the French architect and Egyptologist Jean-Philippe Lauer, who devoted his entire career to the study and restoration of the step pyramid complex, reveals that the structure was built in at least 6 distinct phases, each one larger and more ambitious than the last. The first phase was a mastaba, a flat-topped, rectangular structure built of limestone blocks over the burial shaft that had been excavated into the bedrock. The mastaba was square, an unusual shape for a mastaba, which were typically rectangular, and it was built of small limestone blocks, rather than the mud brick that had been the standard material for mastabas in previous reigns. The decision to build the mastaba in stone rather than mud brick was the first revolutionary step. The step that committed Imhotep and his builders to a new material and a new building tradition. The second phase extended the mastaba on all four sides, making it larger in area but maintaining its flat-topped profile. The third and fourth phases were the crucial ones. They involved the addition of successively smaller mastabas on top of the original, creating the stepped profile that gives the pyramid its name. The final phases increased the number of steps to 6 and extended the base to its final dimensions, producing the structure that we see today, a 6-stepped pyramid of limestone rising 62 meters above the desert floor. The limestone bedrock of the Saqqara plateau varied in quality across its extent. Some layers were hard and dense, suitable for exterior surfaces and load-bearing elements, while others were softer and more porous, useful for interior fill but inadequate for structural purposes. The builders learned to distinguish between these qualities, selecting the appropriate stone for each purpose and developing a practical understanding of materials science that was remarkable for the period. The discrimination between stone types would be refined over subsequent generations into the sophisticated material selection practices that characterized the construction of the later pyramids at Dashur and Giza. The workforce that built the step pyramid was organized into teams and divisions, a hierarchical system drawn from military vocabulary that allowed the labor to be coordinated efficiently across the many different tasks that the construction required simultaneously. The quarrying, the transport, the cutting, the placing, the finishing, and the supply operations all needed to proceed in parallel, and the coordination of these parallel operations required an administrative apparatus of considerable sophistication, an apparatus that tracked the progress of each team, allocated resources where they were needed, and resolved the inevitable conflicts and bottlenecks that arose during a project of this complexity. The logistics of tool supply and maintenance were a critical element of the construction infrastructure. Copper chisels dulled rapidly when used on limestone and required constant resharpening by metal workers who maintained forges at the construction site. The consumption of copper was significant. The construction required a constant supply from the mines of Sinai, transported across difficult terrain to the Nile Valley and then to the construction site. The timber supply presented additional logistical challenges. Wood for sledges, levers, scaffolding, and rollers had to be sourced from Lebanon and transported by sea and river to Egypt, requiring diplomatic negotiations with the Levantine city-states and the maintenance of trade relationships that ensured reliable supply. The water supply for the desert construction site was another unglamorous but essential logistical challenge. Workers needed water for drinking, for mixing gypsum mortar, for wetting sledge paths, and for various industrial processes. The water had to be transported from the Nile several kilometers away, requiring a dedicated system of donkeys, water carriers, and storage facilities that operated continuously throughout the construction period. The role of the priesthood in the construction was significant because the step pyramid was fundamentally a religious project. The priests of the solar cult at Heliopolis provided the theological framework, the orientation to the cardinal points, the placement of the entrance on the north face, the alignment of underground galleries with the cosmic axis. These decisions were informed by religious considerations that the priesthood articulated and that the architect incorporated into the design. The integration of religious requirements and engineering constraints was one of the most demanding aspects of the design process, requiring constant communication between the priestly establishment and the construction team. The construction of the enclosure wall, roughly 10 meters high and more than 1.5 kilometers in circumference, was itself a project of monumental proportions, requiring hundreds of thousands of limestone blocks and years to complete. The wall was not merely a physical barrier, but a ritual boundary. Its palace facade decoration transformed it into a permanent replica of the royal residence, declaring that the space within was a palace for eternity. The 14 false doors served as ritual passages for the pharaoh's spirit, maintaining the connection between the living and the dead that the Egyptian funerary system required. The social implications of the transition from mud brick to stone were as significant as the engineering implications, because the transition required not merely new tools and new techniques, but a new kind of workforce, a workforce whose skills and whose training were fundamentally different from those of the mud brick builders who had constituted the construction labor force in previous generations. Mud brick construction was a skill that any able-bodied person could learn in a relatively short time. The making of bricks, the laying of courses, the plastering of surfaces were tasks that required physical strength and basic coordination, but that did not demand the kind of specialized training that stone construction required. Stone construction demanded specialists. Quarrymen who understood the proper lines of limestone and who could cut blocks of uniform size and shape. Masons who could dress the blocks to smooth surfaces and fit them together with tight joints. Surveyors who could lay out the plan of the building with geometric precision, and foremen who could coordinate the activities of the various specialist groups into a coherent construction process. The creation of this specialized workforce was itself one of the most important consequences of Imhotep's innovation, because the workforce, once created, became a permanent institutional asset that could be deployed on subsequent construction projects, and that could transmit its accumulated knowledge to the next generation of builders. The skilled workers who built the step pyramid did not disappear when the construction was complete. They remained, available for the next project, carrying with them the knowledge and the experience that they had gained during the step pyramid's construction. The workforce was the living repository of the construction knowledge, the institution through which the techniques that Imhotep had pioneered were preserved, refined, and transmitted to the builders who would construct the pyramids of the 4th dynasty a century later. The transmission of knowledge from one generation of builders to the next was accomplished through a system of apprenticeship, a system in which young workers learned their skills by working alongside experienced craftsmen, observing their techniques, practicing under their supervision, and gradually acquiring the practical knowledge that could not be transmitted through written instructions alone. The apprenticeship system was the primary mechanism of knowledge transmission in the ancient world, and it was a mechanism that was remarkably effective at preserving and transmitting practical skills across generations, provided that the institutional framework that supported the apprenticeships remained intact. The vulnerability of the system lay in its dependence on continuity. If the apprenticeship chain was broken, if the experienced craftsmen retired or died without training replacements, the knowledge they carried could be lost in a single generation. The deification of Imhotep, which occurred gradually over the centuries following his death, reaching its fullest expression during the late period and the Ptolemaic era, is one of the most remarkable events in the history of ancient Egyptian religion. The Egyptians did not deify human beings casually. The pharaohs were considered divine by virtue of their office. They were the living incarnations of Horus and the sons of Re, and their divine status was an inherent feature of their kingship, rather than a personal achievement. But non-royal individuals were almost never deified. The distinction between mortal and divine was one of the most fundamental boundaries in the Egyptian religious system, and the crossing of that boundary by a person who was not a king was an event of extraordinary rarity and extraordinary significance. Imhotep crossed that boundary. He was remembered, first as a great sage and a great builder, then as a healer and a patron of wisdom, and finally as a god. The process of deification extended over more than 2,000 years, from Imhotep's death during the 3rd dynasty to his full recognition as a deity during the Ptolemaic period, when temples were built in his honor and pilgrims came to Saqqara to seek his healing power. The duration of the deification process is itself significant. It demonstrates that Imhotep's reputation was not a transient phenomenon, but a persistent and growing tradition that gained strength over the centuries, sustained by the continued existence of the building he had created and by the continued recognition across dozens of generations that the building represented an achievement of unprecedented and unrepeatable genius. The identification of Imhotep with the Greek god Asclepius, the god of medicine and healing, occurred during the Ptolemaic period when the Greek rulers of Egypt sought to reconcile the Egyptian and Greek religious traditions by identifying Egyptian deities with their Greek equivalents. The identification reflects the breadth of Imhotep's reputation. He was not remembered merely as an architect, but as a polymath, a man of universal genius whose knowledge encompassed medicine, architecture, priestcraft, and administration. The breadth of his reputation made him the Egyptian equivalent of the Greek ideal of the universal sage, and the identification with Asclepius ensured that his name would be known to the Greek-speaking world and, through the Greek literary tradition, to subsequent European civilization. The relationship between the Step Pyramid and the nearby mastaba tombs of the First and Second dynasties illustrates the dramatic nature of the break that Imhotep's innovation represented. The mastabas at Saqqara, the tombs of the pharaohs and the high officials of the earliest dynasties, were substantial structures by the standards of their time, with mud brick superstructures that could measure tens of meters in length and several meters in height. But they were horizontal structures. They spread across the surface of the desert rather than rising above it, and they were built of materials that would eventually return to the earth. The Step Pyramid broke with this tradition in every dimension. It rose vertically rather than spreading horizontally. It was built of stone rather than mud brick, and it was designed to dominate the landscape rather than to merge with it. The break was total, the innovation was complete, and the landscape of Saqqara, which had been a field of low, flat, horizontal mastabas for centuries, was transformed in a single reign by the appearance of a vertical stone monument that dwarfed everything around it. The relationship between Imhotep and Djoser, between the architect and the pharaoh, was a partnership that the subsequent Egyptian tradition remembered with particular reverence. The pharaoh provided the authority, the resources, and the religious motivation for the project. The architect provided the vision, the technical knowledge, and the organizational skill to translate the vision into physical reality. The partnership was productive because the two roles were complementary. The pharaoh could not have built the pyramid without the architect, and the architect could not have built the pyramid without the pharaoh's resources and authority. The inscription that links their names on the statue base at Saqqara is a record of this partnership, a permanent acknowledgement that the creation of the Step Pyramid was a collaborative achievement that required both the will of the king and the genius of his most trusted official. The evolutionary nature of the design is itself one of the most important aspects of the Step Pyramid's story, because it demonstrates that the structure was not conceived as a pyramid from the beginning. Imhotep began with a mastaba, the traditional form of royal tomb, and then, as the construction progressed, he transformed it into something entirely new. The transformation was driven by ambition, by the realization that the new material, stone, made it possible to build higher than mud brick ever could, and by the desire to exploit that possibility to create a monument of unprecedented scale and visibility. The stepped pyramid was not a pre-existing design that Imhotep executed according to a plan. It was an invention, a form that was created during the construction process itself, a design that emerged from the interaction between the architect's vision and the material's possibilities. The core problem of the step pyramid is not how it was built, though the engineering challenges were substantial and the solutions were innovative. The core problem is what it represents. The moment in which human civilization crossed a threshold from which it would never return, the threshold between temporary architecture and permanent architecture, the threshold between building for a generation and building for eternity, the threshold between the world of mud brick and the world of stone. The crossing of this threshold was not merely a technical achievement, it was a conceptual revolution, a fundamental change in the way that human beings thought about buildings, about materials, about permanence, and about the relationship between human effort and the passage of time. Before the step pyramid, the assumption, held by every civilization in the world, was that buildings were temporary. They were made of organic materials, wood, reed, mud brick that would eventually decompose, collapse, and return to the earth. The life of a building was measured in decades or centuries, not in millennia. The idea that a building could be permanent, that it could be constructed from materials that would resist the forces of decay indefinitely, was not part of the conceptual vocabulary of the ancient world. Imhotep changed this. He demonstrated that stone, the material of the earth itself, the bedrock on which the desert rested, could be cut, shaped, and assembled into structures of monumental scale that would endure long after the mud brick buildings of the surrounding landscape had crumbled to dust. The demonstration was not theoretical, it was physical, a 62-meter-tall pyramid of limestone that stood on the Saqqara plateau as visible, tangible proof that permanent architecture was possible. The proof was irrefutable. The stone was there, it was not dissolving, it was not eroding, it was not returning to the earth. It was standing, solid, massive, permanent, and it would continue to stand for thousands of years after the mud brick mastabas that surrounded it had vanished. The funerary complex that surrounded the step pyramid was as revolutionary as the pyramid itself, and in some ways more revealing of Imhotep's genius, because it demonstrates the range and the depth of the conceptual transformation that the transition from mud brick to stone entailed. The complex was enormous. It covered an area of roughly 15 hectares, enclosed by a massive limestone wall that measured approximately 10 meters high and that extended for more than 1.5 kilometers around the perimeter. The wall was decorated with a pattern of recessed panels, a design that imitated, in stone, the appearance of the mud brick palace facades that had characterized elite architecture in the early dynastic period. The imitation was deliberate. Imhotep was not merely building in stone, he was translating the existing architectural vocabulary from mud brick into stone, preserving the familiar forms while transforming the material from which they were made. The translation from mud brick to stone extended to every element of the complex. The dummy buildings that lined the courtyards of the complex, the chapels, the shrines, the storage buildings, were stone replicas of structures that had previously been built in mud brick, reed, and wood. The stone replicas reproduced the forms of the original structures with remarkable fidelity, including details that had no structural function in stone, but that faithfully replicated the appearance of the organic originals. Stone columns were carved to resemble bundles of reeds. Stone walls were carved to resemble wooden fences. Stone ceilings were carved to resemble the palm log roofs of mud brick buildings. The reproductions were meticulous. They demonstrate that Imhotep's purpose was not merely to build in stone, but to create, in stone, a permanent version of the entire architectural world that had previously existed only in perishable materials. The underground galleries beneath the step pyramid are among the most remarkable and most extensive subterranean structures in all of Egyptian architecture. The galleries extend for roughly 6 kilometers beneath the pyramid and its surrounding complex, a vast labyrinth of corridors, chambers, and shafts that was carved out of the bedrock of the Saqqara plateau, with a precision and a scale that are difficult to comprehend. The central burial shaft, the vertical shaft that descends from the surface to the burial chamber, is roughly 28 meters deep and 7 meters square, large enough to lower the pharaoh's granite sarcophagus into position and to accommodate the funerary equipment that was placed in the chambers surrounding the burial. The burial chamber itself was lined with granite, blocks of pink Aswan granite that were transported more than 800 kilometers from the quarries in the south, and that were fitted together with a precision that demonstrates the builder's mastery of this exceptionally hard material. The granite lining was a further expression of the pursuit of permanence. Granite is harder and more durable than limestone, and its use for the innermost chamber of the tomb reflected the belief that the pharaoh's body deserved the most permanent protection that human technology could provide. But here's the problem. The most extraordinary feature of the underground galleries is not the burial chamber itself. It is the blue faience tiles that line the walls of a series of chambers adjacent to the burial. The tiles, small rectangular plaques of blue-green faience, each one measuring roughly 6 centimeters long and roughly 2.5 centimeters wide, are arranged in vertical columns that cover the walls of the chambers from floor to ceiling, creating a shimmering blue surface that evokes the appearance of reed mat hangings in the palaces and temples of the living world. The tiles are extraordinary. They represent one of the earliest and most ambitious applications of faience technology in human history, and they demonstrate a level of craftsmanship and a commitment to aesthetic quality that is remarkable for any period and astonishing for the very beginning of the stone building tradition. The faience chambers include carved limestone reliefs that depict the pharaoh Djoser performing the rituals of the Hebsed festival, the Jubilee ceremony that was held to renew the pharaoh's power and to confirm his fitness to rule. The reliefs show Djoser wearing the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, striding between boundary markers and performing the ritual actions that were associated with the festival. The reliefs are among the earliest examples of Egyptian royal relief sculpture, and they establish a tradition of royal self-representation that would continue for more than 3,000 years through every subsequent dynasty and every subsequent period of Egyptian history. The Hebsed court within the Step Pyramid complex deserves more detailed examination because it illustrates, more clearly than any other element of the complex, the conceptual transformation that the transition from mud brick to stone entailed. The Hebsed festival was a living ceremony, a dynamic temporal event that unfolded over several days and that involved music, dance, ritual running, sacrificial offerings, and the formal renewal of the pharaoh's authority through the symbolic reenactment of his coronation. The ceremony was ephemeral. It existed only for the duration of the festival, and the structures that housed it were temporary, built for the occasion, and dismantled when the celebration was complete. Imhotep's genius was to recognize that this temporal ceremony could be translated into spatial form, that the dynamic, unfolding event could be frozen in stone, creating a permanent representation of the festival that the pharaoh could experience in the afterlife for eternity. The translation required a fundamental reconceptualization of the relationship between time and space, the recognition that a building could be not merely a place in which events occurred, but a permanent record of the events themselves, a three-dimensional representation of a temporal experience that could be experienced again and again, forever, by the spirit of the deceased pharaoh moving through the stone replicas of the festival structures. The dummy buildings of the Hebsed court are among the most fascinating architectural elements of the entire complex. They are solid. They have no interior spaces, no rooms, no chambers. They are pure facade. Architectural surfaces that reproduce the appearance of real buildings without providing the functional spaces that real buildings contain. The dummy buildings are, in effect, theatrical sets, stage props rendered in stone, designed to create the visual impression of the festival environment without the practical functionality of the temporary structures they replicate. The concept is extraordinary. It represents one of the earliest examples in human history of architecture as representation, of buildings designed not to be used but to be seen, not to serve a practical function, but to create a visual and symbolic environment that serves a ritual purpose. The columns of the Hebsed court are another remarkable feature. They are engaged columns that are attached to the walls behind them, rather than standing free. The engaged form was probably a structural precaution. The builders, working in stone for the first time, were not yet confident that freestanding columns would be stable enough to support their own weight. The columns are carved to resemble bundles of plant stems, papyrus, lotus, and reed, reproducing in stone the appearance of the organic supports that had been used in the temporary structures of earlier Hebsed celebrations. The plant column motif would become one of the most enduring features of Egyptian architecture, surviving for more than 2,500 years and appearing in temples from the Old Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period. The entrance colonnade, the covered passage that leads from the single real entrance in the enclosure wall to the interior of the complex, is another element that demonstrates the innovative character of the Step Pyramid's architecture. The colonnade consists of 40 engaged columns carved to resemble bundles of ribbed plant stems, arranged in 2 rows on either side of a narrow passage. The columns are remarkable for their size, their precision, and their aesthetic quality. They demonstrate that the builders had already, at the very beginning of the stone building tradition, achieved a level of craftsmanship in stone carving that was capable of producing works of genuine architectural beauty. The serdab, a small sealed chamber attached to the northern face of the pyramid, contained a seated statue of Djoser that was oriented to face outward through 2 small holes in the chamber wall. The statue, one of the oldest life-sized royal statues in Egyptian history, was designed to serve as a substitute body for the pharaoh's spirit, providing an alternative vessel for the Ka in case the mummy was destroyed or damaged. The serdab and its statue illustrate the integration of architecture and sculpture in the Egyptian funerary tradition. The building was not merely a container for the statue, but a partner with it, the 2 elements working together to create a ritual environment in which the spirit of the deceased could be sustained for eternity. The entrance colonnade, the covered passage leading from the single real entrance to the interior of the complex, deserves detailed examination as one of the most architecturally innovative elements of the entire complex. The colonnade consists of 40 engaged columns arranged in 2 rows, each column carved to resemble a bundle of ribbed plant stems. The columns are remarkable for several reasons: their size, their precision, their aesthetic sophistication, and the fact that they represent the earliest known use of the column as an architectural element in monumental stone construction. The engaged form of the columns, their attachment to the walls behind them rather than standing as freestanding supports, was almost certainly a structural precaution reflecting the builder's uncertainty about the load-bearing capacity of stone columns. In mud brick and timber construction, freestanding supports were common. Wooden posts and bundled reed columns had been used for centuries to support roofs and canopies. But stone was a different material, heavier, more rigid, and potentially more brittle than wood or reed. The builders were not confident that a freestanding stone column would be stable, that it would support its own weight and the weight of the roof above without cracking or toppling. The engaged form was a compromise. It provided the visual effect of a column while ensuring structural stability by attaching the column to the wall behind it. The plant stem motif of the columns, the carving that reproduced the appearance of bundled papyrus, lotus, or reed stems, was a deliberate aesthetic choice that connected the new stone architecture to the organic building tradition it was replacing. The columns said, "We are new, but we remember where we came from. We are stone, but we look like plants. We are permanent, but we honor the temporary structures that preceded us." The aesthetic choice was not merely decorative. It was a statement about continuity, about the relationship between the old and the new, about the desire to preserve the familiar forms, even while transforming the material from which they were made. The development of the column from the engaged form at the step pyramid to the freestanding form that would characterize later Egyptian architecture is one of the most important evolutionary sequences in the history of architecture. The engaged columns at Saqqara were the ancestors of the freestanding columns at the temples of Karnak and Luxor, the massive papyrus bud and lotus bud columns that supported the hypostyle halls of the New Kingdom temples, and that are among the most iconic architectural elements of ancient Egypt. The evolution took centuries. The transition from engaged to freestanding columns required the development of new structural techniques and a growing confidence in the load-bearing capacity of stone. But the starting point was Saqqara, the engaged columns of the entrance colonnade, carved by Imhotep's builders in the earliest years of the stone building tradition. The discovery and excavation of the step pyramid complex by modern archaeologists is itself a story of dedication and persistence that mirrors, in its own way, the dedication and persistence that characterized the original construction. The complex was partially buried by sand when the first European travelers visited Saqqara in the 18th and 19th centuries. Its enclosure wall had collapsed in many places, its courtyard buildings had been reduced to rubble, and the pyramid itself, though still standing, had lost its original smooth surface to centuries of erosion and stone robbing. The early explorers recognized the pyramid as ancient, but they did not understand its significance, and they did not appreciate the complexity of the surrounding structures that lay buried beneath the sand. The systematic excavation of the complex began in the early 20th century, conducted by Egyptian and European archaeologists who gradually revealed the entrance colonnade, the Hebsed court, the enclosure wall, and the other elements of the complex that had been hidden for centuries. The excavation was painstaking. Each element had to be carefully exposed, recorded, and analyzed before the next could be addressed. The process took decades, and it was Jean-Philippe Lauer who provided the sustained commitment that the excavation required, returning to Saqqara year after year for 75 years to continue the work of uncovering, studying, and restoring the complex that Imhotep had built. Lauer's contribution cannot be overstated. He arrived at Saqqara as a young architect in 1926, and he left as a centenarian who had devoted his entire professional life to a single archaeological site. His published works, detailed architectural analyses of every element of the complex, reconstructions of the original design, interpretations of the ritual functions of the various structures, remain the definitive studies of the step pyramid complex and the foundation on which all subsequent research has been built. His physical restorations, the re-erected columns, the rebuilt walls, the reconstructed facades, have given modern visitors the ability to experience the complex as an architectural environment rather than as an archaeological ruin. His dedication was extraordinary, and it was appropriate, because the building he devoted his life to studying was itself extraordinary, the most important single innovation in the history of human architecture. The underground galleries beneath the step pyramid have yielded evidence that extends our understanding of early dynastic Egyptian craftsmanship far beyond what the surface structures alone could provide. The galleries contain not only the 40,000 stone vessels, but also fragments of carved relief decoration, remnants of wooden furniture, traces of textile wrappings, and other organic materials that were preserved by the dry, enclosed environment of the subterranean chambers. The preservation of organic materials in the galleries is particularly valuable because organic materials rarely survive in the Egyptian archaeological record. The destructive combination of heat, humidity, and insect activity that characterizes most Egyptian sites destroys wood, textile, and other organic materials within a few centuries. The sealed, dry environment of the step pyramid galleries acted as a preservation chamber, protecting materials that would have been lost in any other context and providing invaluable and otherwise unobtainable evidence for the craftsmanship and the material culture of the early dynastic period that is available from no other surviving source in the Egyptian archaeological record. The precision of the faience tile installation, the uniformity of the tile size, the regularity of the spacing, the consistency of the color across thousands of individual tiles demonstrates a level of quality control and manufacturing consistency that is remarkable for any period and extraordinary for the very beginning of the monumental building tradition. The tiles were produced in large quantities, probably in specialized workshops near the construction site, using standardized molds and standardized firing techniques that carefully ensured uniformity and consistency across the entire extensive production run. Something is wrong with our assumptions when we treat the step pyramid as merely a precursor to the Great Pyramid, as a practice run or an early attempt that was superseded by the more impressive structures that followed. The step pyramid was not a practice run, it was a revolution, the most important single innovation in the history of architecture, the moment in which human beings first demonstrated the ability to build permanent monumental structures from cut stone. Every pyramid that followed, including the Great Pyramid of Giza, was built on the foundation that Imhotep laid at Saqqara. Every stone temple, every stone palace, every stone monument in the entire history of human civilization is a descendant of the structure that Imhotep conceived and built on the desert plateau above Memphis. The 40,000 stone vessels discovered in the underground galleries represent one of the most extraordinary collections of ancient craftsmanship ever found in a single archaeological context. The vessels were carved from a variety of hard stones, alabaster, diorite, schist, breccia, and other materials that required specialized tools and extraordinary patience to work. The carving techniques used to produce the vessels were among the most sophisticated craft techniques in the ancient world. The thinnest vessels had walls that measured only a few millimeters thick, carved with a precision that modern craftsmen find difficult to replicate, even with modern tools. The vessels were not merely functional objects. They were works of art, objects of extraordinary beauty and technical virtuosity that represent the pinnacle of the stoneworking tradition that had developed in Egypt over the preceding centuries. The relationship between the step pyramid and the religious beliefs of the Old Kingdom is more complex and more profound than the simple statement that the pyramid was a tomb suggests. The pyramid was a tomb, but it was also a temple, a ritual stage, a cosmic instrument, and a theological statement about the nature of the pharaoh, the nature of death, and the nature of eternity. The pyramid embodied, in physical form, a set of religious beliefs that were among the most elaborate and most sophisticated in the ancient world. Beliefs about the survival of the soul, the transformation of the dead king into a divine being, and the eternal maintenance of the cosmic order through the ongoing relationship between the living and the dead. The concept of the Ka, the spiritual double that accompanied every Egyptian from birth to death, and that continued to exist after death in the tomb, was central to the design of the step pyramid complex. The Ka needed a physical environment in which to exist, a body to inhabit, the mummy, or failing that, a substitute statue, food and drink to sustain itself, the offerings that were placed in the tomb and replenished at regular intervals, and a physical space in which to live, the tomb itself, with its chambers and its corridors and its decorated walls. The step pyramid complex was designed to meet all of these needs. The burial chamber housed the body, the offering chapels provided the setting for the regular offerings, and the complex as a whole created a physical environment that was designed to sustain the pharaoh's Ka for eternity. The concept of the Ba, the aspect of the soul that could move freely between the tomb and the wider world, was also reflected in the design of the complex. The false doors in the enclosure wall, the serdab with its eye-level openings, the shafts that connected the underground galleries to the surface. All of these features were designed to facilitate the movement of the Ba between the tomb and the world above, allowing the pharaoh's spirit to move freely while maintaining its connection to the body that was housed in the burial chamber below. The astronomical orientation of the pyramid, its alignment to the cardinal points, its entrance on the north face facing the circumpolar stars, reflected the belief that the pharaoh's ultimate destination after death was among the imperishable stars of the northern sky. The circumpolar stars, the stars that never set below the horizon, were called the imperishable ones in Egyptian religious texts, and they were believed to be the destination of the pharaoh's spirit, the place where the dead king would join the gods and participate in the eternal cycle of creation and renewal that sustained the cosmos. The pyramid was designed to facilitate this journey, its form reaching toward the sky, its entrance pointing toward the stars, its internal passages aligned with the celestial axis along which the pharaoh's spirit would travel. The pyramid texts, the religious texts that were inscribed on the walls of later Old Kingdom pyramids, beginning with the Pyramid of Unas at the end of the 5th dynasty, provide detailed information about the religious beliefs that informed the design of the funerary complexes, including, by extension, the step pyramid complex of Djoser, although the step pyramid itself does not contain pyramid texts. The tradition of inscribing texts on pyramid walls began several centuries later. The religious concepts that the texts describe, the journey of the pharaoh's spirit to the stars, the transformation of the dead king into a divine being, the role of offerings and rituals in sustaining the soul, were almost certainly current during Djoser's reign and almost certainly influenced the design of the step pyramid complex. The relationship between the step pyramid and the religious beliefs of the Old Kingdom is more complex than the simple statement that the pyramid was a tomb suggests. The pyramid was simultaneously a temple, a ritual stage, a cosmic instrument, and a theological statement about the nature of the pharaoh and of eternity. It embodied beliefs about the survival of the Ka, the spiritual double that needed a physical environment with a body to inhabit, food to sustain itself, and a space in which to live. The complex met all these needs. The burial chamber housed the body, the offering chapels provided settings for regular offerings, and the complex as a whole created an environment designed to sustain the pharaoh's Ka for eternity. The concept of the Ba, the aspect of the soul that could move freely between tomb and world, was also reflected in the design. The false doors, the serdab with its eye-level openings, and the shafts connecting underground galleries to the surface, all facilitated the bay's movement, allowing the pharaoh's spirit to move freely while maintaining its connection to the body below. The astronomical orientation reflected the belief that the pharaoh's destination was among the circumpolar stars, the imperishable ones that never set below the horizon. The pyramid's form reached toward the sky. Its entrance pointed toward the stars, its passages aligned with the celestial axis, along which the pharaoh's spirit would travel to join the gods in the eternal cycle of creation and renewal. The pyramid texts, inscribed on later Old Kingdom pyramid walls, beginning with Unas at the end of the 5th dynasty, describe religious concepts that were almost certainly current during Djoser's reign. The journey to the stars, the transformation into a divine being, the role of offerings in sustaining the soul. Although the step pyramid itself does not contain these texts, the concepts they describe almost certainly influenced its design and its ritual program. The serdab, the sealed chamber containing Djoser's statue, illustrates the integration of architecture and sculpture in the funerary tradition. The statue served as a substitute body for the Ka, with the 2 small holes in the chamber wall allowing the statue's painted eyes to gaze outward at the offerings presented in the courtyard beyond. The serdab was not merely a container, it was a partner with the statue, the two working together to create a ritual environment for the spirit's eternal sustenance. The question of why the vessels were placed in the underground galleries has been debated by scholars for decades. The most widely accepted interpretation is that the vessels were collected from earlier royal tombs and reburied in the step pyramid as a way of consolidating the wealth and the prestige of the dynasty, concentrating the accumulated treasures of earlier reigns in a single monumental repository that would serve as a permanent testament to the power and the continuity of the royal line. The reburial may also have had a ritual purpose. The vessels may have been considered sacred objects that needed to be protected in a structure that was designed to endure forever, a structure that would preserve them from the deterioration and the looting that threatened objects stored in the less secure mud brick tombs of earlier periods. The presence of vessels from earlier periods in the Step Pyramid's galleries raises questions about the relationship between Djoser's reign and the earlier dynasties, questions about whether the collection of the vessels was an act of piety, honouring the ancestors by protecting their treasures, an act of appropriation, claiming the treasures of earlier reigns for the glory of the current king, or an act of practical conservation, protecting valuable objects from the deterioration of the mud brick tombs in which they had originally been placed. The answer may involve all 3 motivations. The distinctions between piety, appropriation, and conservation were probably less clear to the ancient Egyptians than they are to modern scholars, and the decision to collect and rebury the vessels may have been motivated by a complex mixture of religious, political, and practical considerations. The blue faience tiles that line the underground chambers deserve further examination, because they represent one of the earliest and most ambitious applications of faience technology in human history. Faience is a ceramic material made by heating a mixture of crucite quartz, lime, and an alkaline flux to a temperature that causes the surface to vitrify, producing a glassy coating of vivid color. The blue-green color of the step pyramid tiles was produced by the addition of copper compounds to the faience mixture, a technique that the Egyptians had been developing for centuries and that they had mastered to a degree that allowed them to produce tiles of uniform color and consistent quality in the thousands of individual pieces that were needed to cover the walls of the underground chambers. The arrangement of the tiles, in vertical columns that create a continuous blue-green surface covering the walls from floor to ceiling, was designed to reproduce the appearance of reed mat hangings that decorated the interiors of palaces and temples in the living world. The reproduction was extraordinarily meticulous. The thousands of individual tiles were arranged in a pattern that accurately replicated the visual texture of woven reed mats, creating an underground environment that would have been immediately recognizable to any ancient Egyptian as a representation of a royal interior. The purpose was to provide the pharaoh's spirit with an environment that was familiar and comfortable, a permanent and enduring version of the royal apartments that the king had inhabited during his lifetime, rendered in materials that would endure long after the organic reed mats of the living world had crumbled to dust. And it gets worse. For anyone who dismisses the step pyramid as primitive or unsophisticated, because the underground galleries contain something else. Something that has puzzled archaeologists for more than a century. Buried in the galleries beneath the pyramid were approximately 40,000 stone vessels, bowls, jars, plates, and other containers carved from a variety of hard stones including alabaster, diorite schist, and other materials. The vessels were of extraordinary quality. Many of them were so finely carved that their walls were translucent, thin enough to allow light to pass through the stone. The vessels were not contemporaneous with the pyramid. Many of them dated to earlier periods, some of them to the very beginning of the dynastic period, and they may have been collected from earlier tombs and reburied in the galleries beneath the step pyramid as a way of concentrating the wealth and the prestige of earlier generations in a single monumental repository. The 40,000 vessels are a mystery in themselves. Why were they placed there? Were they offerings to the dead pharaoh? Were they a collection of royal treasures consolidated from earlier burials? Were they a deliberate act of preservation, an attempt to protect the accumulated artistic heritage of the early dynastic period by placing it in a structure that was designed to endure forever? The questions are unanswered, and the vessels remain one of the most remarkable and most poorly understood features of the step pyramid complex. The step pyramid complex contains within its walls a comprehensive demonstration of what the transition from mud brick to stone meant for Egyptian architecture and for human civilization as a whole. Each element of the complex tells a part of the story, and the stories, taken together, constitute one of the most remarkable narratives of innovation in the archaeological record. The first exploration examines the enclosure wall, the massive limestone barrier that surrounded the entire complex, and that was itself a revolutionary achievement in stone construction. The enclosure wall is one of the most impressive elements of the step pyramid complex, not because of its height, which was roughly 10 meters, or its length, which was roughly 1.5 kilometers, but because of its design, which faithfully replicated in stone the appearance of the mud brick palace walls that had been the standard form of elite enclosure in the early dynastic period. The wall was decorated with a pattern of recessed panels, alternating projections and recessions that created a rhythmic visual pattern along the entire length of the wall. The pattern was known as the palace facade motif, and it was a direct translation into stone of a design that had been used for centuries in mud brick architecture. The translation was not merely cosmetic. It demonstrated that the transition from mud brick to stone was a transition of material, not of form. The forms of the existing architectural tradition were preserved. Only the material was changed. The wall contained 14 false doorways that appeared to be real entrances from the outside, but that were actually solid stone, carved to resemble the appearance of open doors with their bolts drawn back. Only one of the 14 doors was real, the entrance to the complex, located in the southeastern corner of the wall. The false doors were a characteristic feature of Egyptian funerary architecture. They were believed to serve as passages through which the spirit of the deceased could move between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The inclusion of false doors in the enclosure wall demonstrates that the step pyramid complex was designed not merely as a monument, but as a functional ritual space, a space in which the boundary between the living and the dead was permeable, and in which the spirit of the pharaoh could move freely between the two realms. The second exploration concerns the Hebsed Court, the large open courtyard within the complex that was designed to replicate, in permanent stone, the temporary structures that were erected for the celebration of the pharaoh's Jubilee festival. The Hebsed festival was one of the most important ceremonies in the Egyptian religious calendar, a Jubilee celebration that was held, in theory, after the pharaoh had reigned for 30 years, and that was intended to renew his physical and spiritual power, to confirm his fitness to rule, and to demonstrate his continued vitality and authority. The festival involved elaborate rituals. The pharaoh ran a ceremonial race, performed sacrifices, received the homage of the gods of Upper and Lower Egypt represented by their cult statues, and was symbolically reborn as a renewed and rejuvenated ruler. The structures that housed these rituals were traditionally temporary, built of wood, reed, and fabric for the duration of the festival, and then dismantled when the celebration was complete. Imhotep reproduced these temporary structures in stone, creating permanent versions of the chapels, shrines, and pavilions that would normally have existed for only a few days. The stone reproductions are remarkable for their fidelity to the organic originals. They include columns carved to resemble bundles of papyrus stems, walls carved to resemble woven reed mats, and roof lines that replicate the curved profiles of reed and fabric canopies. The reproductions are not merely decorative. They are functional statements about the nature of permanence. Declarations that the rituals performed in the temporary structures could be performed eternally in their stone replicas, that the pharaoh's Jubilee renewal could continue forever in the afterlife, and that the stone architecture of the complex could sustain the ritual life of the deceased pharaoh for eternity. The third exploration examines the role of Jean-Philippe Lauer, the French architect and archaeologist who devoted his entire professional career to the study and restoration of the Step Pyramid complex, and who is, in many ways, as important to the modern understanding of the complex as Imhotep was to its original creation. Lauer first arrived at Saqqara in 1926 as a young architect assigned to assist with the restoration work that was then being conducted at the site. He stayed for 75 years, returning to Saqqara season after season, decade after decade, until his death in 2001 at the age of 99. His career at Saqqara was one of the most extraordinary examples of sustained scholarly dedication in the history of archaeology, a commitment to a single site and a single subject that produced a body of work that remains the definitive study of the Step Pyramid complex, and that has shaped every subsequent interpretation of the site and its significance. Lauer's contribution was both scholarly and practical. He published detailed studies of the complex's architecture, analyzing the construction techniques, reconstructing the original design, and interpreting the function of each element of the complex within the framework of Egyptian funerary religion. He also directed the physical restoration of the complex, re-erecting fallen columns, rebuilding collapsed walls, and stabilizing the structure of the pyramid itself to prevent further deterioration. The restoration work was painstaking and controversial. Some archaeologists criticized Lauer for reconstructing elements of the complex that had been too badly damaged to be restored with certainty, arguing that reconstruction risked replacing ancient evidence with modern interpretation. But Lauer defended his approach on the grounds that without restoration, the complex would continue to deteriorate until nothing remained, that the choice was not between restoration and preservation, but between restoration and loss. The fourth exploration examines the engineering innovations that the construction of the Step Pyramid required, the specific technical problems that the builders had to solve in order to translate their architectural vision into physical reality. The most fundamental problem was the problem of stone cutting. The builders of the Step Pyramid were working with limestone, the sedimentary rock that constitutes the bedrock of the Saqqara Plateau, and that was the primary building material for the complex. Limestone is a relatively soft stone, softer than granite, softer than basalt, softer than many of the stones that later Egyptian builders would learn to work, but it is still stone, and cutting it into blocks of uniform size and shape required tools and techniques that were fundamentally different from the tools and techniques used to make mud bricks. The builders used copper tools, chisels, adzes, and saws, that were capable of cutting limestone but that were soft enough to require constant resharpening. They used stone hammers, balls of dolerite, and other hard stones that could be used to pound and shape the limestone blocks. They used wooden levers and ropes to move the blocks from the quarry to the construction site. And they used their own ingenuity, developing techniques for cutting, shaping, transporting, and placing stone blocks that had no precedent in the existing building tradition and that had to be invented from scratch. The block size at the step pyramid is one of the most revealing features of the construction, because the blocks are small, much smaller than the blocks used in the Great Pyramid a century later. The blocks at the step pyramid are roughly the size of large mud bricks, a dimension that reflects the builders' familiarity with mud brick construction and their natural tendency to work with blocks of a size that they were accustomed to handling. The small block size made the construction labor intensive. More blocks were needed to fill a given volume, and more joints between blocks created more potential points of weakness in the structure. But the small block size also made the construction manageable. The blocks could be carried by one or two workers. They could be placed by hand without the need for the elaborate lifting equipment that would be required for the larger blocks of later pyramids, and the consequences of a single misplaced block were relatively minor compared to the consequences of misplacing a multi-ton block in a later pyramid. The relationship between the step pyramid and the earlier mastaba tombs at Saqqara illustrates the evolutionary process by which the innovation was achieved. The mastabas of the first and second dynasties at Saqqara were substantial structures, mud brick buildings that enclosed underground burial chambers and that were decorated with the palace facade motif that Imhotep would later reproduce in stone in the enclosure wall of the step pyramid complex. The mastabas were tombs, structures designed to protect the body of the deceased and to provide a ritual focus for the offerings and prayers that sustained the spirit in the afterlife. The step pyramid was also a tomb, but it was a tomb of a fundamentally different kind, a tomb that was designed not merely to protect the body, but to make a statement, to dominate the landscape, to proclaim the power and the permanence of the king to every person who saw it from the valley below. The transition from the flat-topped mastaba to the stepped pyramid was a transition of ambition as much as of form. The mastaba was a horizontal structure. It spread across the surface of the desert, covering a large area but rising only a few meters above ground level. The pyramid was a vertical structure. It rose above the desert floor, reaching toward the sky, visible from a distance, dominating the landscape in a way that no mastaba ever could. The verticality was new. It represented a fundamental change in the way that Egyptian architects thought about the relationship between their buildings and the landscape, a change from buildings that merged with the desert to buildings that rose above it. The economic and organizational demands of the step pyramid's construction were, for their time, unprecedented. No previous construction project in Egypt, indeed, no previous construction project anywhere in the world, had required the quarrying, shaping, transporting, and placing of such a large volume of stone. The project required the development of new skills: stone quarrying, stone cutting, stone finishing, stone setting, that had not existed in the Egyptian building tradition before. It required the training of a workforce that could perform these skills at a scale and a pace that met the demands of the construction schedule, and it required an administrative apparatus that could coordinate the many different aspects of the construction: the quarrying, the transport, the placement, the supply of tools and materials, the feeding and housing of the workforce, and the management of the many specialized tasks that the construction required. The tools that the builders used were simple but effective. Copper chisels were the primary cutting tools, capable of cutting limestone, though they dulled quickly and required constant resharpening. Stone hammers, balls of hard stone such as dolerite that could be used to pound and shape the limestone blocks, supplemented the copper chisels. Wooden levers and ropes were used to move and position the blocks. Plumb bobs and set squares were used to ensure that the blocks were placed accurately and that the walls were vertical. The tools were the same tools that would be used, in refined and improved forms, for the construction of every subsequent pyramid and temple in Egyptian history. A basic toolkit that proved sufficient for the construction of some of the most impressive structures in the ancient world. The mortar that was used in the step pyramid's construction is another significant technical detail. The blocks were not dry laid. They were joined with a mortar made of gypsum plaster, a material that was produced by heating gypsum rock and then grinding the resulting powder into a fine paste that could be applied between the blocks. The mortar served both as an adhesive and as a leveling agent, filling the small gaps between blocks and creating a smooth, continuous surface on which the next course could be laid. The use of mortar was a practical solution to the problem of block irregularity. The small limestone blocks of the step pyramid were not cut with the precision that would later characterize the blocks of the Great Pyramid, and the mortar compensated for the imperfections by filling the gaps and creating a stable, level surface. The recent conservation and restoration work at the Step Pyramid, conducted by Egyptian authorities under the direction of various conservation specialists over the past 2 decades, has been one of the most ambitious and most controversial preservation projects in Egypt. The pyramid was in danger of collapse. Centuries of earthquake damage, groundwater infiltration, and the simple weight of time had weakened the internal structure, causing portions of the ceiling of the underground galleriges to crack and threatening the stability of the pyramid itself. The restoration work involved the injection of stabilizing materials into the weakened areas, the reinforcement of the internal chambers, and the repair of the exterior surfaces that had been damaged by erosion and vandalism. The work was completed and the pyramid was reopened to visitors in 2020 after a 14-year closure that underscored the urgency of the conservation effort and the fragility of even the most enduring structures when subjected to the accumulated stresses of nearly 5 millennia. The 5th exploration examines the South Tomb, a secondary burial structure within the Step Pyramid complex that provides additional evidence for the religious beliefs and the ritual practices that the complex was designed to serve. The South Tomb is a rectangular structure located at the southern end of the Step Pyramid complex, smaller than the pyramid itself but still substantial, with its own underground galleries and its own burial chamber. The purpose of the South Tomb has been debated by scholars. Some interpret it as a tomb for the pharaoh's Ka, the spiritual double that the Egyptian religious system believed accompanied every individual through life and into the afterlife. Others interpret it as a symbolic representation of the traditional royal burial at Abydos, the sacred city in Upper Egypt, where the earliest kings had been buried and where the god Osiris was believed to have his tomb. The South Tomb, like the pyramid, contained blue faience tiles and carved reliefs depicting the pharaoh, confirming its importance within the ritual program of the complex and its role in the religious ceremonies that sustained the pharaoh's soul in the afterlife. The integration of architecture and ritual in the Step Pyramid complex reflects a characteristic feature of Egyptian civilization that would persist throughout the entire pharaonic period: the belief that buildings were not merely functional spaces but ritual instruments, structures that actively participated in the religious ceremonies they housed, and that contributed to the efficacy of the rituals through their form, their decoration, and their orientation. The Step Pyramid complex was designed as a ritual machine. Every element of the complex served a specific ritual purpose, and the complex as a whole was designed to create the conditions under which the pharaoh's spirit could be sustained in the afterlife for eternity. The orientation of the pyramid, with its entrance on the north face and its primary axis aligned to the cardinal points, was a ritual decision as much as an engineering one. The north was associated, in Egyptian religious thought, with the circumpolar stars, the stars that never set below the horizon and that were believed to be the destination of the pharaoh's spirit after death. The alignment of the pyramid to the north was therefore an expression of the pyramid's function as a launch pad for the pharaoh's celestial journey, a structure that was oriented toward the eternal stars, and that was designed to facilitate the pharaoh's transition from the earthly realm to the celestial realm. The boundaries of the complex defined by the massive enclosure wall with its 14 false doors and its single real entrance, were ritual boundaries as much as physical ones. The enclosure wall defined the sacred space within which the rituals of the afterlife would be performed, separating the sacred from the profane, the eternal from the temporal, the realm of the dead from the realm of the living. The false doors in the wall served as ritual passages, doors through which the spirit of the deceased could move between the two realms, maintaining the connection between the living and the dead that was essential to the functioning of the Egyptian funerary system. The processional route through the complex, from the entrance in the southeastern corner through the entrance colonnade into the Great Court, and then to the pyramid itself, was a ritual route, a path that the participants in the funerary ceremonies would have followed, and that was designed to lead them through a sequence of spaces that replicated, in permanent stone, the sequence of spaces that would have been traversed during the actual funeral and the subsequent offering ceremonies. The route was designed to be experienced sequentially, each space leading to the next in a progression that built in scale and in sacred significance, culminating in the pyramid itself, the focal point of the entire complex and the structure that housed the pharaoh's body and his spirit. The structural engineering of the step pyramid reveals both the ambition and the limitations of the builder's knowledge, the combination of bold innovation and cautious experimentation that characterized the first generation of stone construction in Egypt. The pyramid's core is not solid stone. It is a combination of stone blocks and rubble fill, with the stone blocks forming the outer faces and the structural framework, and the rubble filling the interior spaces. The combination was a practical solution to the problem of volume. Building the entire pyramid from precisely cut stone blocks would have been prohibitively time-consuming and labor-intensive, while building it entirely from rubble would have been structurally unsound. The combination of stone and rubble achieved a balance between structural integrity and construction efficiency that would be refined, but never fundamentally changed, in the subsequent pyramid building tradition. The inward lean of the courses, the slight inward inclination of each successive layer of blocks, was a structural innovation that contributed to the stability of the pyramid. By tilting the courses inward rather than laying them level, the builders ensured that the weight of the structure was directed toward the center rather than toward the edges, reducing the outward thrust that could cause the sides to collapse. The technique was simple but effective. It demonstrated an intuitive understanding of structural mechanics that the builders had developed through their experience with mud brick construction, and that they applied, with appropriate modifications, to the new medium of stone. The underground galleries present their own set of engineering challenges that the builders addressed with a combination of innovation and improvisation. The galleries were carved from the bedrock, a process that required the removal of thousands of cubic meters of limestone from the subterranean spaces beneath the pyramid. The carving was done from the top down. The builders excavated from the surface, cutting downward through the bedrock to create the burial shaft, and then cutting horizontally to create the galleries that radiated from the central shaft. The process was labor-intensive and potentially dangerous. The galleries were deep, the air circulation was limited, and the risk of collapse was ever present. The builders addressed these challenges with practical solutions: ventilation shafts to provide fresh air, timber supports to prevent collapse, and a systematic approach to excavation that minimized the risk of structural failure. The granite used for the burial chamber, pink Aswan granite, transported more than 800 kilometers from the quarries in the south, was the hardest and most durable material available to the builders, and its use for the innermost chamber of the tomb reflected the priority that the builders placed on the permanent protection of the pharaoh's body. The granite was cut and fitted with a precision that demonstrates the builder's mastery of this exceptionally difficult material. The joints between the granite blocks are tight and clean, with surfaces that are smooth and well finished. The use of granite at the step pyramid establishes a tradition that would continue throughout the pharaonic period. The tradition of using the hardest and most durable materials for the most sacred and the most important elements of the funerary complex. The recent restoration work, completed in 2020 after more than a decade of effort, addressed structural problems that had accumulated over nearly 5 millennia of natural and human forces. The most serious problems involved the underground galleries, where the limestone ceilings had cracked under the weight of the pyramid above, and where groundwater infiltration had weakened the structural integrity of the surrounding bedrock. The restoration involved the injection of specialized grout into the cracks, the installation of steel supports to reinforce the weakened areas, and the careful repair of the surfaces that had been damaged by water and by the physical impact of falling debris. The work was technically demanding and politically sensitive. Any intervention in a structure of such historical importance required careful justification and meticulous execution to ensure that the conservation measures did not themselves cause damage to the ancient fabric. The structural engineering of the step pyramid reveals the combination of bold innovation and cautious experimentation that characterized the first generation of stone builders. The core is not solid stone. It combines stone blocks forming the outer faces and structural framework, with rubble filling the interior. This practical solution balanced structural integrity and construction efficiency. The inward lean of the courses, tilting each layer slightly toward the center, directed weight inward rather than outward, reducing the thrust that could collapse the sides. The technique demonstrated intuitive structural understanding applied from mud brick experience to the new stone medium. The underground galleries present their own engineering challenges. Carved from bedrock by excavating downward from the surface and then horizontally, the work was labor-intensive and dangerous. The galleries were deep, air circulation was limited, and collapse risk was constant. The builders addressed these with ventilation shafts, timber supports, and systematic excavation methods. The granite burial chamber, pink Aswan granite, transported more than 800 kilometers, used the hardest available material for the most sacred space. The joints between granite blocks are tight and clean, demonstrating mastery of this exceptionally difficult material and establishing a tradition that would continue throughout the pharaonic period. The gypsum mortar used between the blocks served as both adhesive and leveling agent, filling gaps between imperfectly cut blocks and creating stable surfaces for successive courses. The mortar compensated for the imperfections that were inevitable in the first generation of stone construction, when the precision that would later characterize the Great Pyramid had not yet been achieved. The dummy buildings of the step pyramid complex, the solid stone structures that reproduce the forms of real buildings without providing functional interior spaces, raise profound questions about the nature of architecture and the relationship between form and function that remain relevant to architectural theory today. The dummy buildings are, in the most literal sense, non-functional. They cannot be entered, they cannot be used, they serve no practical purpose whatsoever. They are pure form, architectural surfaces that create the visual impression of buildings without the substantive reality of buildings. They are, in a modern vocabulary, architectural representations. Buildings that represent other buildings, stone structures that represent organic structures, permanent objects that represent temporary ones. The concept of architectural representation. The idea that a building can serve a symbolic or ritual function by representing another building rather than by functioning as a building in its own right was one of Imhotep's most innovative contributions to the history of architecture. The concept had no precedent in the existing building tradition. Mud brick buildings were functional, designed to be used and occupied, and the idea of building a structure that was intentionally unusable would have been alien to the mud brick builders of the earlier period. The concept was made possible by the new material. Stone, which was expensive and labor-intensive to work, justified the creation of non-functional structures only if those structures served a purpose that was more important than practical utility. The purpose was ritual. The dummy buildings served the pharaoh's spirit in the afterlife, providing the visual and symbolic environment that the spirit needed for its eternal ritual activities. The concept of architectural representation that Imhotep pioneered at the step pyramid would become a fundamental feature of Egyptian funerary architecture, appearing in the false doors of tomb, chapels, in the model buildings placed in tombs as grave goods, in the painted architectural scenes on tomb walls, and in the symbolic architectural elements that decorated sarcophagi and coffins. The concept extended beyond architecture to other domains. The model boats, model servants, model food offerings, and model tools that were placed in Egyptian tombs all embodied the same principle, that a representation could serve the same ritual function as the thing it represented, provided that the representation was accurate enough and that the ritual conditions were correct. The principle was fundamental to the Egyptian approach to the afterlife, and its earliest and most ambitious expression was the step pyramid complex at Saqqara. The Hebsed court's ritual function connects to the broader question of how the Egyptians understood the relationship between time and eternity, a question that is central to the entire funerary tradition and that the step pyramid complex addresses with particular directness. The Hebsed festival was a temporal event. It occurred at a specific moment in time, it lasted for a specific duration, and it produced specific effects, the renewal of the pharaoh's power, that were understood to be temporary, requiring periodic repetition to maintain their efficacy. The stone reproduction of the festival structures at the step pyramid transformed this temporal event into a spatial reality, creating a permanent environment in which the festival could be celebrated continuously, without interruption, for eternity. The transformation was, in conceptual terms, a solution to the problem of time, the problem that all temporal events are fleeting, that all effects are temporary, and that all power, including the power of the pharaoh, eventually fades unless it is constantly renewed. The influence of the step pyramid on subsequent Egyptian pyramid design can be traced through a detailed comparison of the construction techniques used at Saqqara with those used at the later pyramid, sites of Meidum, Dahshur, and Giza. The comparison reveals a process of continuous refinement, each successive pyramid building on the techniques developed at the previous site, incorporating lessons learned from earlier successes and failures, and gradually approaching the level of precision and the scale of ambition that would culminate in the Great Pyramid of Khufu. The block size increased steadily from the step pyramid to the Great Pyramid. At Saqqara, the blocks were small, roughly the size of large mud bricks, reflecting the builders' familiarity with mud brick construction and their cautious approach to working with a new material. At Meidum, the blocks were larger, reflecting the builders' growing confidence in their ability to quarry, transport, and place heavier stones. At the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid at Dahshur, the blocks were larger still, and the construction techniques had been refined to allow the placement of blocks with greater precision and at greater heights. At Giza, the blocks reached their maximum size, with the core blocks averaging 2.5 tons and the granite beams above the king's chamber weighing as much as 80 tons. The precision of construction also increased steadily across the sequence. The step pyramid's base is roughly level, but not precisely so. The variations in level across the base are measured in centimeters, acceptable for the first monumental stone building, but far from the precision that later builders would achieve. The Great Pyramid's base, by contrast, is level to within 2.1 centimeters across an area of more than 53,000 square meters, a level of precision that is remarkable by any standard, and that represents the culmination of a century of progressive refinement in surveying and leveling techniques. The transition from the stepped profile to the true pyramid profile, the smooth, unbroken slope from base to apex that characterizes the pyramids from the Red Pyramid onward, was a development that required both mathematical knowledge and practical experimentation. The stepped profile of the step pyramid was a natural consequence of the construction method. Each layer was a mastaba, and the stepping was created by building each successive mastaba on a smaller footprint. The true pyramid profile required a different approach, a casing of smooth, angled stones that covered the stepped core and created a continuous surface from base to apex. The transition was accomplished gradually, through the experiments at Meidum and Dahshur that tested different angles and different casing techniques. and it was completed at the Red Pyramid, which was the first true pyramid to be successfully constructed. The evolution from Step Pyramid to Great Pyramid is one of the most impressive examples of sustained technological development in the ancient world. A century of continuous refinement that transformed the experimental first attempt at Saqqara into the masterwork at Giza. The evolution was not the work of a single individual or a single generation. It was a collective achievement, the accumulated work of thousands of builders across multiple reigns, each generation building on the knowledge and the experience of the previous one. The collective nature of the achievement does not diminish the importance of Imhotep's original innovation, because the collective work was possible only because Imhotep had created the foundation on which it was built. The Step Pyramid was the beginning. Everything that followed was development, and development, however impressive, always presupposes a beginning. The question of workforce size for the Step Pyramid's construction has been estimated by various scholars based on the volume of stone, the estimated quarrying and transport rates, and the assumed construction timeline. The estimates vary, from several thousand to several tens of thousands of workers, reflecting the uncertainty about many of the key variables. The volume of stone is known with reasonable accuracy, approximately 330,000 cubic meters. The quarrying rate can be estimated from experimental data and from comparisons with later construction projects. The transport rate depends on assumptions about the distance from quarry to construction site, the number of workers per sledge, and the efficiency of the transport method. The construction timeline is not precisely known, but the assumption that the pyramid was built during a single reign of roughly 20 years provides a reasonable upper bound. The most plausible estimates suggest a core workforce of several thousand skilled workers, quarrymen, masons, surveyors, and other specialists, supplemented by a larger force of temporary labourers who were recruited through the corvée system during the agricultural off-season. The total workforce may have numbered between 5,000 and 15,000 at its peak, smaller than the workforce that would be required for the Great Pyramid a century later, but still enormous by the standards of the early Third Dynasty, representing a significant proportion of the available labour force and requiring a logistical support system of considerable complexity. The management of the construction, the coordination of the quarrying, transport, cutting, placing, and finishing operations, the supply of tools and materials, the feeding and housing of the workforce, the tracking of progress, and the resolution of problems was the responsibility of Imhotep and his administrative staff. The management challenge was unprecedented. No previous construction project had required the coordination of so many different activities on so large a scale, and the administrative techniques that Imhotep and his team developed to manage the project were themselves innovations, contributions to the development of large-scale project management that would be refined and applied to subsequent construction projects throughout the Old Kingdom. The South Tomb, the secondary burial structure at the southern end of the complex, provides additional evidence for the religious beliefs that the complex was designed to serve. The South Tomb is smaller than the pyramid, but substantial in its own right, with underground galleries that mirror those beneath the pyramid and that contain their own set of blue faience tiles and carved relief panels. The purpose of the South Tomb has been interpreted in various ways. As a tomb for the pharaoh's Ka, as a symbolic representation of the traditional royal burial at Abydos, or as a canopic burial for the preservation of the pharaoh's internal organs. Whatever its specific function, the South Tomb demonstrates that the ritual program of the complex was more elaborate than the pyramid alone would suggest, that the complex contained multiple burial structures serving different ritual purposes, each one contributing to the comprehensive system of spiritual protection and sustenance that the complex was designed to provide. The boundary between the Step Pyramid complex and the surrounding cemetery is itself a feature of archaeological interest. The enclosure wall defined a sacred precinct, a bounded space within which the rules of the funerary ritual applied, and beyond which the ordinary world continued. The precision with which the boundary was defined, the massive wall, the false doors, the single controlled entrance, demonstrates the importance that the Egyptians placed on the distinction between the sacred and the profane, between the space of the dead and the space of the living. The boundary was not merely physical, it was metaphysical, a barrier between two modes of existence, two states of being, two dimensions of reality that were fundamentally different and that needed to be kept separate to ensure the proper functioning of both. The decorative program of the complex, the carved reliefs, the blue faience tiles, the plant column capitals, the palace facade panels, constitutes one of the earliest comprehensive decorative programs in the history of monumental architecture. The program was not random or improvised. It was planned, designed to create a consistent visual and symbolic environment that served the ritual purposes of the complex and that communicated, through its forms and its motifs, the theological messages that the complex was intended to convey. The planning of the decorative program was itself an innovation, an early example of the integrated approach to architectural design that would characterize Egyptian monumental architecture. Throughout the pharaonic period, an approach in which the structure, the decoration, and the ritual function of the building were conceived as a unified whole rather than as separate elements that were assembled independently. The integration of the various elements of the complex into a coherent architectural and ritual whole was Imhotep's most demanding achievement, requiring not merely the ability to design and build individual structures, but the ability to conceive of the entire complex as a unified system in which each element served a specific function and in which the relationships between the elements were as important as the elements themselves. The integration was conceptual as well as physical. It required an understanding of the ritual program that the complex was designed to serve, and an ability to translate that understanding into architectural form. The achievement was unprecedented. No previous architect had ever designed a complex of this scale and this complexity, and it established a standard for integrated architectural design that would influence Egyptian monumental architecture for the next 2,500 years. The recent conservation work completed in 2020 addressed problems accumulated over nearly 5 millennia: cracked ceilings in the underground galleries, groundwater infiltration weakening the bedrock, and the cumulative effects of earthquakes and erosion. The restoration involved injection of stabilizing grout, installation of steel reinforcements, and careful surface repair. The 14-year closure that preceded the reopening underscored the urgency of the conservation effort and the fragility of even the most enduring structures under the accumulated stresses of nearly 50 centuries. The comparison between the Step Pyramid complex and later Egyptian funerary complexes, the pyramid complexes of the 4th, 5th, and 6th dynasties, the mortuary temples of the New Kingdom, the temple tombs of the Ptolemaic period, reveals both the continuity and the evolution of the Egyptian funerary tradition. The basic elements of the funerary complex: the tomb structure, the offering chapel, the processional route, the enclosure wall, the subsidiary buildings that served specific ritual functions, were established at the Step Pyramid and were maintained, with modifications and elaborations, throughout the entire pharaonic period. The continuity demonstrates the conservatism of the Egyptian religious tradition, the tendency to preserve established forms and practices across centuries and millennia, adapting them to new circumstances but never abandoning them entirely. The evolution demonstrates the dynamism of the tradition, the capacity for innovation within the framework of continuity, the willingness to experiment with new forms and new techniques while maintaining the essential elements of the established ritual program. The transition from the stepped pyramid to the true pyramid, from the mud brick enclosure wall to the stone enclosure wall, from the simple offering chapel to the elaborate mortuary temple. These transitions represent innovations within a continuous tradition, developments that built on the foundation that Imhotep had laid at Saqqara, without abandoning the ritual principles that the foundation embodied. The sixth exploration concerns the broader significance of the Step Pyramid within the history of Egyptian architecture, its role as the foundation on which the entire tradition of monumental stone building was constructed. The Step Pyramid was not an endpoint, it was a beginning. the first step in a building tradition that would develop over the following centuries into the most impressive and the most enduring architectural tradition in the ancient world. The techniques that were pioneered at the step pyramid, the methods of quarrying, cutting, transporting, and placing stone blocks, were refined and improved by subsequent builders, producing structures of increasing size, increasing precision, and increasing ambition. The pyramids of Sneferu, the Maiden Pyramid, the Bent Pyramid, and the Red Pyramid were the next steps in the progression, each one larger and more technically sophisticated than the last. The Great Pyramid of Khufu was the culmination, the moment when the tradition that Imhotep had initiated reached its fullest expression and produced the largest and most precise stone structure in the ancient world. But the tradition did not end with the pyramids. The techniques of stone construction that were developed at the step pyramid were applied to every category of Egyptian architecture, to temples, to palaces, to fortifications, to obelisks, to colossal statues. The great temples of the New Kingdom, Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, were built using techniques that were direct descendants of the techniques that Imhotep's builders had pioneered at Saqqara. The continuity is remarkable. A building tradition that began with the step pyramid around 2670 BC, and that continued without fundamental interruption for more than 2,500 years, until the end of the Ptolemaic period and the Roman conquest of Egypt. Step back now from the architectural details and the engineering innovations and the archaeological discoveries. Step back from the step pyramid as a building and look at it as something else, as a moment in time, a turning point in the history of human civilization, a boundary marker between two fundamentally different ways of inhabiting the world. Before the step pyramid, human beings built for the present. Their buildings were functional. They provided shelter, they stored food, they housed the rituals of the community, and they served as places of burial for the dead. But the buildings were not permanent. They were made of materials that decayed: wood, reed, mud brick, thatch, and they were understood to be temporary. The building would serve its purpose for a time, and then it would fail. Its walls would crumble, its roof would collapse, its materials would return to the earth from which they came. The building was a tool, it was not a monument. After the step pyramid, human beings began to build for eternity. The new material, stone, made it possible to conceive of buildings that would outlast their builders, that would outlast the civilization that produced them, that would outlast the gods in whose name they were built. The conception was revolutionary. It changed the relationship between human beings and time, between the present and the future, between the living and the dead. The building was no longer merely a tool. It was a message sent across time from the present to the future, a message that said, we were here, we were capable, and we built something that would outlast us. Let that sink in. The step pyramid is that message. It has been standing on the Saqqara plateau for 4,700 years, longer than any other monumental stone building on Earth. It has survived the fall of the Old Kingdom, the chaos of the First Intermediate Period, the glory of the Middle Kingdom, the humiliation of the Hyksos invasion, the triumph of the New Kingdom, the decline of the Third Intermediate Period, the conquests of the Persians, the Greeks and the Romans, the coming of Islam, the Crusades, the Ottoman Empire, the colonial period, and the modern Egyptian Republic. It has survived because it was built of stone, and because the stone was placed with enough care and enough skill to resist the forces of erosion, earthquake, and human interference that have destroyed virtually every other structure from the same period. The survival of the step pyramid raises a question that is both practical and philosophical. The question of what survives and why. The mud brick mastabas that surrounded the step pyramid at the time of its construction have largely vanished, reduced to low mounds of eroded earth that are barely distinguishable from the natural landscape. The wooden structures that house the living, the palaces, the workshops, the domestic buildings of the Old Kingdom capital at Memphis are completely gone, their organic materials long since decomposed. The textiles, the papyri, the leather goods, the food, the flowers, the organic artifacts that filled the homes and the tombs of the Old Kingdom Egyptians have, with rare exceptions, disintegrated. What survives is stone. The stone buildings, the stone statues, the stone vessels, the stone inscriptions. These are the artifacts that have endured, the fragments from which we reconstruct our understanding of a civilization that existed 4,700 years ago. This is not science fiction. This is the actual condition of archaeological knowledge, a knowledge that is shaped by the survival of specific materials and the loss of others, a knowledge that is biased towards stone and against organic materials, toward the permanent and against the temporary, toward the monumental and against the domestic. The step pyramid represents one end of this survival spectrum. It is the ultimate survivor, the structure that has endured longer than any other monumental building, the artifact that has resisted the forces of destruction more successfully than any other product of human hands. The mud brick mastabas that surrounded it represent the other end. They are the structures that did not survive, the buildings that returned to the earth from which they were made, the monuments that time has erased. The contrast between the survivor and the lost illuminates something profound about the nature of human achievement. The fact that the things we build are only as durable as the materials we build them from, and that the choice of material is therefore a choice about the future. Imhotep chose stone. He chose permanence. He chose to build something that would outlast him, that would outlast his pharaoh, that would outlast the civilization that produced it. The choice was deliberate. It was conscious. It was motivated by the religious conviction that the pharaoh's tomb must endure forever. But it was also, whether Imhotep recognized it or not, a choice about the relationship between human beings and time, a choice that would transform the way that every subsequent civilization thought about building and about the future. Let that sink in. The philosophical implications of the step pyramid's innovation extend beyond the history of architecture to the deepest questions about human creativity and the nature of invention. The step pyramid represents a specific type of innovation, the type that creates an entirely new category of human activity rather than merely improving an existing one. Imhotep did not build a better mud brick mastaba. He built something that had never existed before, a monumental stone building, a structure that belonged to a category that had not existed before his creation of it. The innovation was categorical rather than incremental. It did not improve the existing tradition, but created a new one, opening possibilities that had not been imaginable before the innovation occurred. The distinction between categorical and incremental innovation is important because it illuminates the special character of the step pyramid's achievement. Most innovations are incremental. They improve existing products, existing processes, existing methods by making them faster, cheaper, more efficient, or more reliable. Incremental innovations are valuable. They drive the gradual improvement of technology and the gradual increase of human capability over time. But they do not transform. They do not create new categories. They do not open new possibilities. And they do not fundamentally change the way that human beings think about the world and their place in it. Categorical innovations are different. They create new possibilities. They open new domains of activity. They transform the conceptual landscape in which subsequent innovations will occur. The wheel was a categorical innovation. It created the entirely new category of wheeled transport. Writing was a categorical innovation. It created the entirely new category of recorded information. The step pyramid was a categorical innovation. It created the entirely new category of monumental stone architecture. Each of these innovations transformed the world in ways that the inventors themselves could not have fully anticipated, creating chains of subsequent innovation that extended for millennia and that produced results that were unimaginable at the moment of the original breakthrough. The step pyramid's influence extended beyond Egypt, beyond the borders of the Nile Valley, and into the broader world of ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern architecture. The Egyptians were not the only civilization in the ancient world to build monumental structures. The Mesopotamians built ziggurats, the people of the Indus Valley built citadels, and the builders of megalithic monuments in Europe and elsewhere created structures of impressive scale using uncut or roughly cut stone. But the Egyptian tradition of monumental stone architecture The tradition that began with the step pyramid was distinguished by its use of precisely cut and dressed stone blocks, a technique that produced structures of a precision and a durability that were unmatched in the ancient world. The Greek architects who visited Egypt during the first millennium before the Common Era were deeply impressed by the Egyptian stone building tradition, and they adapted Egyptian techniques and Egyptian forms to their own architectural purposes. The Greek column, the defining element of Greek architecture, has been traced by some scholars to Egyptian prototypes, including the engaged columns of the step pyramid complex. The connection is debated. The Greek column may have developed independently, or may have been influenced by multiple sources, but the possibility of Egyptian influence demonstrates the reach and the importance of the tradition that Imhotep founded. The Roman architects who conquered Egypt in the 1st century, before the Common Era, encountered a building tradition that was already more than 2,500 years old, a tradition that had produced some of the most impressive structures in the ancient world, and that continued, in diminished form, under the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Romans were impressed. They adopted Egyptian architectural elements, including obelisks, which they transported to Rome and erected in the city's public spaces. The Roman appreciation of Egyptian architecture reflects the enduring power of the tradition that the step pyramid had initiated, a tradition that continued to command respect and admiration thousands of years after its founding. The question of what would have happened if the step pyramid had not been built, if Imhotep had not made the conceptual leap from mud brick to stone, if the conditions that produced the innovation had not converged at the specific moment and place where they did, is a counterfactual question that historians are trained to avoid, but that illuminates the significance of the innovation by forcing us to imagine its absence. Without the step pyramid, the Egyptian building tradition would have continued in mud brick, producing structures that were larger and more elaborate than their predecessors, but that were fundamentally limited by the material's inability to resist the forces of erosion and decay. Without the step pyramid, the Great Pyramid would not have been built, because the techniques, the knowledge, and the organizational methods that made the Great Pyramid possible were developed over the century that separated the two structures. Without the step pyramid, the entire tradition of Egyptian monumental architecture, the temples, the obelisks, the colossal statues, the rock-cut tombs, would not have existed in the form that we know it, because the tradition was built on the foundation of stone construction that Imhotep established. The step pyramid's influence on Greek and Roman architecture, however indirect and however debated by scholars, illustrates the long reach of the innovation that Imhotep initiated. The Greek architects who visited Egypt during the 1st millennium, before the Common Era, encountered a building tradition that was already more than 2,000 years old, and that had produced structures of a scale and a precision that the Greek world could not yet match. The influence of Egyptian stone architecture on Greek architecture is debated. Some scholars see direct connections between Egyptian columns and Greek columns, between Egyptian temple forms and Greek temple forms, while others argue that the Greek tradition developed independently. But the possibility of influence demonstrates the importance of the Egyptian tradition and the importance of the step pyramid as the founding monument of that tradition. The Roman appreciation of Egyptian architecture, expressed through the transport of obelisks to Rome, the construction of Egyptian-style monuments, and the enthusiastic appropriation of Egyptian artistic motifs, reflects the enduring power of the tradition across millennia and across cultural boundaries. The Romans were not sentimental antiquarians. They were pragmatic builders who recognized quality when they saw it, and what they saw in Egyptian stone architecture was a tradition of craftsmanship and durability that deserved respect and emulation. The modern architectural tradition, the tradition that has produced the cathedrals of Europe, the mosques of the Islamic world, the temples of South and East Asia, and the skyscrapers of the modern city, is connected to the step pyramid by a chain of continuous development that extends across nearly 5 millennia. The chain is long and its links are sometimes obscure. The connections between Egyptian stone architecture and medieval European stone architecture, for example, are mediated by Greek and Roman architecture and by the Byzantine tradition that transmitted classical building techniques to the medieval world. But the chain is real, and its first link is the step pyramid of Saqqara, the building that demonstrated, for the first time in human history, that stone could be used to create monumental structures of permanent duration. The counterfactual illuminates a deeper point about the nature of historical causation, the point that some events are more consequential than others, that some innovations have effects that ramify across centuries and millennia, and that the identification of these pivotal moments is one of the most important tasks of historical analysis. The step pyramid is a pivotal moment, a point in the chain of historical causation at which a single innovation produced effects that extended far beyond the immediate context of the innovation and that transformed the built environment of the human world in ways that are still visible today. The identification of the step pyramid as a pivotal moment is not a matter of Egyptian national pride or archaeological parochialism. It is a matter of historical fact. The fact that monumental stone architecture began at Saqqara and that every subsequent development in the tradition can be traced through a chain of continuous development back to the building that Imhotep conceived and built 4,700 years ago. The chain of innovation that began with the step pyramid extended for more than 2,500 years in Egypt alone. From the step pyramid of Giza through the pyramids of the 4th dynasty, the sun temples of the 5th dynasty, the pyramid complexes of the 6th dynasty, the Middle Kingdom pyramids, and the great stone temples of the New Kingdom and the Ptolemaic period. Each link in the chain built on the innovations of the previous link, refining the techniques, expanding the scale, increasing the precision, and extending the range of architectural forms that could be achieved in stone. The chain did not end with Egypt. It extended to Greece, to Rome, to Byzantium, to medieval Europe, to the Renaissance, and to the modern world. Every stone building in human history is a link in a chain that begins with the step pyramid of Saqqara. The question of why the innovation happened in Egypt rather than in some other civilization is a question that illuminates the specific conditions that make categorical innovation possible. The answer involves several factors: the availability of building stone, the religious demand for permanent tombs, the wealth and organizational capacity of the Egyptian state, and the presence of an individual with the vision and the skill to conceive and execute the transition. No single factor was sufficient. All of them were necessary, and their convergence at a specific moment in history was the contingent circumstance that produced the innovation. Other civilizations, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China, possessed some of these factors but not all of them, and the absence of one or more critical factors delayed or prevented the development of monumental stone architecture in those civilizations until much later periods. The question of what the step pyramid means for our understanding of human creativity, of how new ideas are generated, how they are translated into physical reality, and how they transform the societies that produce them, is a question that the building itself answers more eloquently than any theoretical analysis could. The step pyramid is a creative act, one of the most important creative acts in human history, an act that brought into existence something that had never existed before, and that opened possibilities that had not been imaginable before the act occurred. The creativity was not abstract. It was not a theory or a concept or an idea written on papyrus. It was physical, a 62-meter-tall structure of cut limestone, standing on the desert plateau above Memphis, visible for kilometers in every direction, undeniable in its materiality and irrefutable in its demonstration, that the creative act had been real and that the creative vision had been successfully translated into physical form. The physicality of the creative act is important, because it distinguishes the step pyramid from other forms of creativity that leave no permanent trace. A song, once sung, disappears into silence. A story, once told, fades from memory. A dance, once performed, leaves no mark on the earth. But a building made of stone, designed for permanence, constructed with care and skills, endures. It persists. It stands as permanent, physical, undeniable evidence that the creative act occurred and that the creative vision was realized. The step pyramid is this evidence, the permanent physical proof that Imhotep's creative vision was real and that his translation of that vision into stone was successful. The modern world's tendency to overlook the step pyramid in favor of the Great Pyramid reflects a broader cultural bias toward the spectacular over the foundational, a bias that values the biggest, the tallest, and the most impressive over the most original, the most innovative, and the most consequential. The bias is understandable. The Great Pyramid is a visually overwhelming structure whose size and precision make an immediate and visceral impression on every visitor. The step pyramid is more modest. Its weathered surface and its smaller scale do not create the same immediate impact, and its significance is intellectual rather than visual, requiring knowledge and reflection rather than simple observation to be fully appreciated. But the bias is wrong, because it values outcomes over origins, products over processes, and the culmination of a tradition over the invention that made the tradition possible. The Great Pyramid is the outcome. The step pyramid is the origin. The Great Pyramid is the product of a century of accumulated knowledge and refined technique. The step pyramid is the invention that set the century of accumulation and refinement in motion. Without the step pyramid, there is no Great Pyramid. Without Imhotep's conceptual breakthrough, there is no tradition of monumental stone architecture. Without the first, there is no best. The bias toward the spectacular obscures this fundamental truth, and the correction of the bias requires the recognition that the most important buildings in history are not always the most impressive to look at. The distinction between the step pyramid and the Great Pyramid, between the first and the most famous, illuminates a broader pattern in the history of human achievement. The pattern in which the innovator is overshadowed by the optimizer. The person who creates a new category is overshadowed by the person who perfects it. Imhotep created monumental stone architecture. The builders of the Great Pyramid perfected it. The perfection is more visible than the creation. The Great Pyramid is larger, more precise, and more geometrically pure than the step pyramid. But the creation is more important than the perfection, because without the creation, the perfection would not have been possible. The innovator enables the optimizer. The first enables the best. And the step pyramid, the first monumental stone building in human history, enabled everything that followed. The modern conservation of the step pyramid, the ongoing effort to preserve the building against the forces of erosion, earthquake, groundwater infiltration, and human interference, is itself a form of tribute to Imhotep's innovation. The conservation effort represents a commitment by the modern world to maintain the building that Imhotep designed. A commitment that echoes, across nearly 5 millennia, the commitment that Imhotep and his builders made to permanence when they chose stone over mud brick, and began the construction of the first monumental stone building in human history. The commitment is not easy to maintain. The conservation of ancient stone structures is expensive, technically demanding, and politically complex, requiring the allocation of scarce resources, the expertise of specialized professionals, and the cooperation of multiple institutions with sometimes conflicting priorities. The step pyramid competes for conservation resources with hundreds of other ancient monuments in Egypt, monuments that are also deteriorating, that also require intervention, and that also have claims on the limited funds available for archaeological conservation. The allocation of resources is a decision about priorities, and the decision to invest in the conservation of the step pyramid is, implicitly, a judgment about the building's importance, a recognition that the first monumental stone building in human history deserves to be preserved for future generations to study, to visit, and to be inspired by. The grief moment of the step pyramid story is not a death or a destruction. It is a realization. The realization that the genius of Imhotep, the brilliance of his innovation, the extraordinary achievement of the first monumental stone building in human history has been overshadowed by the structures that came after it. The Great Pyramid is more famous. The temples of the New Kingdom are more visited. The golden mask of Tutankhamun is more photographed. The step pyramid is known, but it is known as a precursor, an early attempt a stepping stone on the way to something greater. The characterization is unjust. The step pyramid was not a stepping stone. It was the step, the first step, the foundational step, the step without which none of the subsequent achievements would have been possible. Look at the step pyramid from a distance, from the road that approaches Saqqara from the north, or from the plateau of Giza, where the Great Pyramid stands on the horizon. From a distance, the step pyramid appears modest, a stepped structure of weathered limestone that lacks the geometric perfection and the imposing scale of its more famous successors. The appearance is deceiving. The step pyramid is not modest. It is foundational, the building on which the entire tradition of monumental stone architecture was built, the innovation that made possible every pyramid, every temple, every stone monument that the Egyptian civilization produced over the next 2,500 years. The implications of the step pyramid extend far beyond the history of Egyptian architecture. They extend to the history of human civilization as a whole, to the question of how innovations happen, how they spread, and how they transform the societies that produce them. The step pyramid was an innovation of the first order, a breakthrough that created an entirely new category of human activity, monumental stone construction, and that opened possibilities that had not existed before. The innovation was not inevitable. It required a specific combination of circumstances, a civilization with the resources and the organizational capacity to support monumental construction, a religious system that demanded permanence, a site with accessible limestone bedrock, and an individual with the vision and the technical skill to conceive and execute the transition from mud brick to stone. The combination of circumstances was unique. It occurred at a specific time, in a specific place, under the influence of a specific individual. The uniqueness is the point. Innovations are not inevitable. They are contingent. They depend on the specific circumstances that produce them, and they can be delayed, diverted, or prevented by changes in those circumstances. If Imhotep had not been born, if he had died before completing his work, if Djoser had not provided the resources, if the limestone bedrock at Saqqara had not been accessible, the transition from mud brick to stone might have been delayed by decades or even centuries. The entire trajectory of Egyptian architecture, and, by extension, the entire trajectory of monumental architecture in human history, might have been different. The role of the individual in history is a question that historians have debated for centuries. The question of whether history is shaped by great individuals or by impersonal forces, whether the course of human civilization is determined by the actions of specific people or by the structural conditions that produce those actions. The step pyramid provides evidence for both sides of the debate. The structural conditions were necessary. The wealth of the Egyptian state, the demand for permanent tombs, the availability of limestone. But the structural conditions were not sufficient. They had existed for generations before Imhotep, and no one had built a monumental stone structure before him. The individual mattered. Imhotep mattered. His vision, his skill, and his willingness to attempt something that no one had ever attempted before were the catalysts that transformed the structural conditions into a physical reality. The step pyramid stands today as both a monument and a warning. A monument to the power of human innovation and a warning about the fragility of even the most enduring human creations. The pyramid has survived for 4,700 years, but it has not survived unchanged. The original smooth limestone surface has been roughened by wind erosion. The upper courses have been partially dismantled by stone robbers who removed blocks for use in later construction. The underground galleries have been damaged by earthquakes and by the infiltration of groundwater that has weakened the structural integrity of the ceilings. The pyramid that stands today is not the pyramid that Imhotep built. It is a weathered, diminished version of the original, a structure that has been altered by nearly 5 millennia of natural and human forces. The conservation challenges facing the step pyramid are representative of the challenges facing ancient monuments worldwide. The challenge of preserving structures that were designed for eternity, but that are, in practice, subject to the same forces of erosion, decay, and human interference that affect all material objects. The challenge is both technical and philosophical. Technical, because the conservation of ancient stone structures requires specialized knowledge and specialized materials. Philosophical, because the decision about how much to conserve, how much to restore, and how much to leave in its deteriorated state is a decision about values rather than about engineering. Jean-Philippe Lauer's approach to the step pyramid, his willingness to reconstruct elements of the complex that had been too badly damaged to survive without intervention, represented one position in this ongoing debate. Lauer believed that the complex should be restored to something approaching its original appearance, that the visitor should be able to see the enclosure wall, the entrance colonnade, the Hebsed court, and the other elements of the complex as Imhotep had designed them, rather than as piles of collapsed stone that conveyed no impression of the original architectural vision. His critics argued that reconstruction replaced ancient evidence with modern interpretation, that the restored elements, however carefully researched, were modern creations rather than ancient originals, and that they risked misleading visitors about the actual state of the surviving evidence. The debate is not merely academic. It touches on the fundamental question of what archaeological sites are for, whether they are repositories of evidence that should be preserved in their found state for the benefit of future scholars, or whether they are places of education and inspiration that should be restored to a condition that allows visitors to understand and appreciate the achievements they represent. The Step Pyramid complex embodies both purposes. It is a repository of evidence that has been studied by scholars for more than a century, and it is a place of education and inspiration that receives thousands of visitors each year. The tension between these purposes, between the needs of scholarship and the needs of public engagement, is the tension that defines the conservation debate, and that will continue to shape the treatment of the Step Pyramid for generations to come. The visitors who come to Saqqara today, the tourists, the students, the scholars, the photographers, the curious travelers who make the journey from Cairo to the desert plateau above Memphis, encounter a landscape that is at once ancient and modern, sacred and secular, preserved and deteriorating. The Step Pyramid dominates the landscape, its stepped profile visible from the entrance to the archaeological site, its weathered limestone surface glowing golden in the afternoon light. Around the pyramid, the remains of the complex spread across the plateau, the restored entrance colonnade, the partially reconstructed enclosure wall, the ruins of the Hebsed court, the entrance to the underground galleries that descend into the darkness beneath the pyramid. The experience of visiting Saqqara is different from the experience of visiting Giza. Giza is crowded, packed with tourists, with vendors, with guides, with the noise and the commerce that surround one of the most popular tourist destinations in the world. Saqqara is quieter, less visited, less commercialized, more contemplative. The quiet is appropriate, because the Step Pyramid is a building that rewards contemplation rather than spectacle, a building whose significance is not immediately obvious to the casual visitor, but that reveals itself gradually, through knowledge and reflection, as the most important building in the history of human architecture. The fact that we can still visit the Step Pyramid today, that we can walk through the entrance colonnade, stand in the Great Court, gaze up at the stepped profile of the pyramid, and descend into the underground galleries, where the blue faience tiles still shimmer in the lamplight, is itself a testament to the durability of Imhotep's innovation and to the effectiveness of the conservation efforts that have maintained the structure across the centuries. The building was not designed to be visited by tourists. It was designed to be visited by the spirit of the dead pharaoh, a spirit that would move through the stone corridors and stone courtyards for eternity, performing the rituals of the afterlife in an environment that was designed to sustain those rituals forever. The fact that living human beings can now walk through the same spaces, can see the same columns, touch the same walls, stand in the same courtyards, is an unintended consequence of the building's permanence, a bonus that the builders could not have anticipated, but that has, across the millennia, transformed the Step Pyramid from a private funerary monument into a public treasure that belongs to all of humanity. The ongoing archaeological work at Saqqara continues to produce discoveries that add to our understanding of the site and its significance. Recent excavations in the area surrounding the Step Pyramid complex have uncovered tombs, workshops, and other structures from various periods of Egyptian history. Discoveries that demonstrate that Saqqara was not merely the site of Djoser's pyramid, but a living cemetery that was used for burials and religious ceremonies for more than 3,000 years, from the earliest dynasties to the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. The discoveries confirm that the Step Pyramid's influence extended far beyond its original construction, that the pyramid continued to serve as a focal point for the religious life of the Saqqara cemetery for millennia after its builder and its architect had died. The conservation debate that has surrounded the Step Pyramid, the debate between those who advocate restoration and those who advocate minimal intervention, reflects a broader tension in the field of archaeological conservation between the desire to preserve the past and the desire to make the past accessible and comprehensible to the present. The tension is real, and it is not easily resolved, because the two goals are sometimes in conflict, and the methods that serve one goal may undermine the other. Lauer's restorations at Saqqara, the re-erected columns, the rebuilt walls, the reconstructed facades, have made the Step Pyramid complex more comprehensible to visitors than it would otherwise be. Without Lauer's work, visitors to Saqqara would see piles of collapsed stone rather than architectural spaces. They would have no sense of the entrance colonnade's height and rhythm, no impression of the Hebsed court's ceremonial grandeur, no understanding of the enclosure wall's monumental scale. Lauer's restorations have given visitors the ability to experience the complex as an architectural environment rather than as an archaeological ruin, and that experience has, in turn, generated public interest and public support for the continued preservation of the site. But the restorations have also generated criticism. Criticism that the reconstructed elements are modern creations that may mislead visitors about the actual state of the ancient evidence, that the restoration decisions were based on incomplete data and may not accurately represent the original design, and that the physical intervention involved in reconstruction may have damaged ancient surfaces and obscured ancient evidence that would have been valuable to future scholars working with more advanced analytical techniques. The criticism is valid, and it reflects the genuine difficulty of making conservation decisions about structures of extraordinary historical importance, where the consequences of both action and inaction are potentially irreversible. The relationship between the Step Pyramid and the Great Pyramid of Giza. The relationship between the first monumental stone building and the most famous monumental stone building is a relationship of genealogy rather than competition. The Great Pyramid is the descendant of the Step Pyramid, the product of a building tradition that the Step Pyramid initiated and that developed over a century of sustained effort and experimentation into the technique that was capable of producing the largest and most precise stone structure in the ancient world. The Great Pyramid could not have been built without the Step Pyramid, without the techniques, the knowledge, the organizational methods, and the conceptual framework that Imhotep's innovation had created. The relationship is not one of supersession. The Great Pyramid did not replace the Step Pyramid or render it obsolete. The relationship is one of development. The Great Pyramid was the mature expression of a tradition that the Step Pyramid had founded, the culmination of a process of innovation that began with the first block of limestone that Imhotep's builders cut from the bedrock of the Saqqara Plateau. The modern world can learn from the Step Pyramid not merely about ancient engineering, but about the nature of innovation itself. The most transformative innovations are not incremental improvements to existing technologies. They are conceptual breakthroughs, fundamental changes in the way that problems are understood and solutions are imagined. Imhotep did not improve mud brick construction. He replaced it with a material and a method that were fundamentally different and that offered capabilities that the old material could never provide. The innovation was radical, it was disruptive, and it was permanent. It transformed the Egyptian building tradition so thoroughly that mud brick was never again used for monumental royal architecture. There is a building in the desert south of Cairo that has been standing for 4,700 years. It does not look like much, a weathered, stepped structure of eroded limestone, its original smooth surface long since roughened by wind and sand and the slow, patient work of time. It is not the largest pyramid in Egypt. It is not the most famous. It does not appear on most postcards. It does not draw the crowds that gather at Giza to photograph the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx. But it is the most important building in the history of human civilization. It is the first monumental stone structure, the first permanent building, the first human creation that was designed to outlast not merely its builder, but the entire civilization that produced it. It is the building that proved that permanence was possible, that stone could be cut, shaped, and assembled into structures of monumental scale that would endure long after the mud brick buildings of the surrounding landscape had crumbled to dust. The building was designed by a man named Imhotep, a vizier, a priest, a physician, and an architect whose genius was recognized by his contemporaries, celebrated by subsequent generations, and eventually honored with something that no other non-royal Egyptian ever received: deification. The Greeks identified him with Asclepius, their god of healing. The Egyptians worshipped him for centuries as a god of wisdom and medicine. His name has been remembered for nearly 5,000 years, an achievement that rivals, in its own way, the achievement of the building he designed. The building was constructed for a pharaoh named Djoser, a king of the 3rd dynasty, whose reign marked the beginning of the Old Kingdom, the period of Egyptian history that would produce the pyramids, the Sphinx, and the most impressive monuments of the ancient world. Djoser's name is remembered because of the building that Imhotep designed for him, a building that served as his tomb, his monument, and his gateway to eternity. Imhotep's achievement was recognized by the civilization that produced it, and by every civilization that has encountered it since. The Egyptians honored him with deification, an unprecedented distinction that placed him among the gods, and that ensured his name would be remembered as long as the civilization endured. The Greeks honored him by identifying him with their own god of healing, Asclepius, a recognition that his reputation had spread beyond the borders of Egypt and that his genius was appreciated by cultures that had no direct connection to the building tradition he had founded. The modern world honors him by studying his work, by excavating the Step Pyramid complex, by analyzing its architecture, by publishing scholarly studies of its construction techniques, and by preserving the structure for future generations. The honor is deserved. Imhotep was one of the most important individuals in the history of human civilization, a person whose innovation transformed the way that human beings build, the way that human beings think about buildings, and the way that human beings relate to the passage of time. The innovation was not merely technical, it was philosophical, a fundamental change in the human relationship to permanence, a demonstration that human beings could create objects that would outlast not merely their creators, but the entire civilizations that produced them. The demonstration was made in stone, on the desert plateau of Saqqara, 4,700 years ago, and the stone is still there, still standing, still carrying its message across the millennia, still proving that the innovation was real, and that the man who conceived it was worthy of the honor that his civilization bestowed upon him. The desert wind blows across the Saqqara plateau. The sand gathers at the base of the Step Pyramid. The tourists come and go, photographing a building that most of them do not fully understand. A building that looks, from the outside, like a smaller, rougher, less impressive version of the pyramids at Giza. But the appearance is misleading. The Step Pyramid is not a lesser version of the Great Pyramid. It is the foundation, the building without which the Great Pyramid could not exist, the innovation without which the entire tradition of monumental stone architecture would not have been born. The foundation is always less visible than the structure it supports. But the foundation is always more important, because without it, the structure cannot stand. The Step Pyramid is the foundation. It has been supporting the entire tradition of monumental stone architecture for 4,700 years, and it shows no signs of stopping. Imhotep's name has survived for nearly 5,000 years, carved in stone, passed down through generations of Egyptian tradition, celebrated by the Greeks and the Romans, studied by modern scholars. The survival of the name is itself a testament to the durability of the innovation. The achievement was so extraordinary that the civilization that produced it never forgot the man who made it possible in a culture that measured its history in millennia and that remembered its pharaohs in king lists that stretched back to the beginning of time. The name of a non-royal official, a vizier, a priest, a physician, an architect, was preserved with a reverence that was normally reserved for gods and kings. The preservation of Imhotep's name across nearly 5,000 years of human history raises a question about the relationship between individual achievement and historical memory. The question of what kinds of achievements are remembered and what kinds are forgotten. The pharaohs who built the later pyramids, Sneferu, Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure, are remembered for their monuments, but Imhotep is remembered for something different, for the idea. Not for the size of his building or the precision of its construction, but for the conceptual breakthrough that made the building possible. The pharaohs are remembered for what they built. Imhotep is remembered for what he invented, and the invention has proven more durable than any individual building, because the buildings, however magnificent, are material objects that are subject to erosion and decay, while the invention, the concept of monumental stone architecture, is an idea that has survived intact, without erosion or decay, for nearly 5,000 years. The building is the step pyramid of Saqqara. It has been standing for 4,700 years. It has survived every empire, every invasion, every earthquake, every sandstorm, and every act of human interference that the centuries have produced. It has survived because it was built of stone, the material that Imhotep chose because he understood, 4,700 years before any other human being would fully appreciate the implication that the choice of material is a choice about the future, and that the future belongs to stone. The pyramid was not built for tourists. It was not built for archaeologists. It was not built for the modern world at all. It was built for a pharaoh who has been dead for 4,700 years. A pharaoh whose body has been lost, whose treasures have been scattered, and whose name would have been forgotten entirely, if not for the building that his architect designed, and his workers constructed on the desert plateau above Memphis. The building has outlived everything else. The pharaoh is gone, the architect is gone. The civilization that produced them both has been superseded by faiths and cultures that did not exist when the first stone was laid. But the building remains, weathered, diminished, stripped of its original smooth surface, but still standing, still carrying its message across the millennia, still proving that the innovation was real and that the choice of stone over mud brick was the most consequential architectural decision in human history. The pyramid still stands. The mastabas that surrounded it are dust. The palace of Djoser is gone. The city of Memphis is buried beneath the fields of the modern village of Mitni Rahina. The language in which Imhotep wrote his plans and his calculations has been deciphered but is no longer spoken. The religion in which the pyramid was built has been superseded by faiths that did not exist when the first stone was placed. Everything has changed. Everything has passed. Everything has been transformed by the passage of 4,700 years. Everything except the building. The building remains. The step pyramid of Saqqara, Imhotep's gift to Djoser, Djoser's gift to eternity, and humanity's first successful attempt to build something that time could not destroy, stands on the desert plateau above the ruins of Memphis, patient and enduring, the oldest monumental stone building on Earth, the ancestor of every stone structure that has been built in the 4,700 years since a man named Imhotep looked at a block of limestone and saw the future. The future is still here, the stone is still standing, and the message that the stone carries, the message that was carved into the desert 4,700 years ago by a civilization that understood the power of permanence, is as clear today as it was on the day the last block was placed. We were here, we built this, and it will outlast us all.